Have you ever wondered what it meant to be the eyes of your people in a world wrapped in snow and silence? What kind of person would step willingly into the frozen wilderness, knowing that warmth and companionship lay behind them, and that ahead stretched only white emptiness and watchful cold? Tonight, we journey back to a time when winter was not a season to be conquered with thermostats and heated cars, but a vast presence to be negotiated with, step by careful step, breath by visible breath. We'll follow the path of the winter scout, those nearly invisible guardians who moved through the snow-laden forests and frozen plains of pre-colonial North America, carrying the survival of their people in their quiet vigilance. These were not the warriors celebrated in raids nor the chiefs who sat in council. They were something quieter, something more patient, figures who understood that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in confrontation, but in the willingness to be alone with the cold and the dark, to listen when others sleep, to watch when others gather close to fires. Before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the early peoples of North America, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Your small gesture helps these stories find others who seek this same gentle refuge in history's quieter corners. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten places, those moments and lives that slip so easily through memory's grasp, but which, when retrieved with care, offer us something precious: perspective, wonder, and the deep comfort of knowing that humans have always endured, always adapted, always found meaning even in hardship. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, the house quiet around you, seeking these soft voices from the past to ease you toward rest. Others might be just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between, that strange, suspended hour when the world hasn't quite decided what it is yet. Now dim the lights if you can. Maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, or simply settle deeper into your pillow. Let your breathing slow. We're not going anywhere quickly tonight. Time itself will stretch and soften as we move backward through the centuries, toward a winter that was harsher, yes, but also somehow more intimate, a season when every human soul knew its own fragility and found strength in that knowing. Let's settle in together for tonight's quiet journey through history. You wake before true dawn in the deep heart of winter, though wake isn't quite the right word. You haven't been fully asleep, not really. Sleep is a luxury that belongs to those who rest behind the reinforced walls of the winter camp, where fires burn steadily and multiple families share body heat in close quarters. For you, sleep comes in shallow waves, never quite pulling you under, because even in rest, your ears must remain alert. A snapped branch under the weight of snow. The particular silence that precedes a predator's approach. The change in wind direction that might carry your scent towards something with sharper teeth than yours. The darkness around you is not the comfortable darkness of a warm lodge. It is the particular darkness of a snow-hollowed shelter that you scraped out yesterday afternoon. Or was it the day before? The days blur together in winter, each one a subtle variation on the theme of cold and watchfulness. Your shelter is simple, a shallow depression dug into a snowbank on the lee side of a large spruce, lined with boughs you stripped from lower branches, their needles still releasing that sharp, clean scent of evergreen. Over this modest hollow you've propped more branches in a rough lattice, enough to break the wind and prevent snow from falling directly onto your face, but not substantial enough to trap smoke if you dared to light a fire, which you don't. Fire is for those who can afford to announce their presence. Fire is warmth and comfort, yes, but it is also a beacon visible for miles in the clear winter air, a column of smoke that rises straight and true on a windless day, a smell that carries on every breeze. You are not here to be seen. You are here to see and to return unseen. The cold has worked its way into your bones during the night, the kind of cold that makes your jaw ache and your shoulders feel permanently hunched. Your sleeping robe, buffalo hide, traded last summer from the plains, peoples to the west, thick and valuable and still not quite enough, has kept you from the worst of it, but moisture from your own breath has condensed and frozen in the fur near your face. Small crystals of ice have formed in your hair, which you haven't properly washed in 2 weeks, not that you mind particularly. The body's oils help insulate, help repel some moisture. Vanity has no place in the winter forest. You flex your fingers inside the robe, feeling the stiffness, the reluctance of joints that have cooled during the night. Your hands are perhaps your most precious tools, more valuable than your knife, your snares, even your bow. Your hands must remain nimble enough to adjust your snowshoes, to set a snare with precision, to nock an arrow should an unexpected opportunity present itself. But they ache now with the memory of yesterday's work, and there are small cracks forming at the knuckles where the skin has dried and split, despite the bear grease you rubbed into them 3 days ago. The grease has mostly worn away now, absorbed or rubbed off through contact with your tools and the constant work of survival. You carry a small pouch of it, rendered carefully back in the main camp, mixed with a bit of spruce pitch to help it hold, but you ration it carefully. Who knows how long this journey will stretch? Who knows when you'll return? You push yourself to sitting, careful not to dislodge the shelter roof. The air that hits your face is sharp enough to make your eyes water instantly. You estimate, from the quality of darkness, that peculiar pre-dawn grey that is not yet light but is no longer the full depth of night, that you have perhaps an hour before the sun makes its weak appearance over the eastern tree line. An hour to prepare, to eat, to scout the immediate area, and to decide on the day's route. Your moccasins sit beside you, stiff with cold. They're double-layered, an inner moccasin of soft rabbit fur with the hide turned inward against your skin, and an outer moccasin of heavier deer hide with the hair left on for added insulation and traction. Both pairs are damp. This is the eternal problem of winter travel. Your feet sweat from exertion during the day, moisture works its way into the hide, and overnight everything freezes solid. Come morning, you must work the leather in your hands, flexing and massaging until it's soft enough to wear without causing blisters. Then force your feet into footwear that feels like shaped ice until your body heat gradually softens it again. You do this now, rhythmically working each moccasin, feeling the leather resist and then slowly yield. The process takes time, perhaps 10 minutes, but rushing would be worse. A blister in winter, when you might walk 15 or 20 miles in a day through snow, can become a serious problem. A serious problem can become a crisis. A crisis can become the quiet, unremarkable way that someone simply doesn't return. While your hands work the leather, your eyes adjust to the dimness, and you scan what you can see of your surroundings. The snow's surface has that particular crust that forms when melt and refreeze cycle through the day and night, solid enough to hold some weight, but not quite solid enough to trust completely. Yesterday, you broke through a dozen times, plunging suddenly thigh-deep into powder beneath the crust, wasting energy with every recovery. Today may be the same, though the night was cold enough that the crust might hold better. You'll learn soon enough. The spruce branches overhead are laden with snow, bent under the weight like old men under heavy packs. The forest around you is a study in greys and whites, every tree outlined in accumulated snow, every branch weighted down. It's beautiful in an austere way, though you don't spend much time thinking about beauty. Beauty doesn't keep you alive. Attention does. Memory does. The ability to read subtle signs in the landscape, a track barely visible in lee snow, the particular way branches break when something large has pushed through, the configuration of animal trails that speak to where water might be found under ice. Your food bag is cached in a tree about 30 paces from your shelter, hung high enough that no opportunistic creature could reach it during the night. This is habit born of hard experience. Once, in your first winter as a scout, you kept your food beside you in your sleeping shelter. Once was enough. You woke to find a fox had crept in, bold with hunger, and torn open your bag of dried meat, scattering and ruining half your supplies. You returned to camp early that trip, hungry and humbled. The older scouts said nothing to you directly, but their eyes carried the lesson clearly enough. Your hunger is not the forest's problem to solve. Now you rise stiffly, wrap your robe tighter, and move to the tree where your bag hangs. Your breath plumes in front of you, each exhalation a small cloud that dissipates slowly in the still air. The cold penetrates immediately, finding every gap in your layered clothing, deerskin leggings, a longer shirt of elk hide, a shorter overshirt of rabbit fur, all worn under the heavy buffalo robe. It seems like it should be enough. It never quite is. You lower the bag and return to your shelter, where at least the snow walls break the wind. Inside the bag, pemmican, made from dried buffalo meat, pounded together with rendered fat and dried berries, shaped into small cakes that are dense and calorie-rich. Also a handful of dried fish, caught and smoked last autumn when the salmon ran, a smaller pouch of parched corn traded from agricultural peoples to the south, and wrapped carefully in bark, a precious piece of maple sugar, hard as stone, to be dissolved slowly in your mouth when the cold feels most unbearable. You choose pemmican and dried fish for your morning meal. The pemmican is frozen solid, of course, so you hold it in your mouth, letting your body heat slowly soften it enough to chew. The taste is rich, fatty, slightly sweet from the berries. Saskatoon berries, you think, or perhaps choke cherries. The person who made this batch knew their craft. The fat coats your mouth and throat, providing some insulation. Against the cold air, you continue to breathe. The dried fish is leathery, requiring patient chewing, but it too carries valuable fat and salt from the smoking process that your body craves. You eat slowly, methodically, not from any sense of enjoyment, but from necessity. This food is fuel. Your body is a fire that must be kept burning, and this is the wood you feed it. You melt snow in your mouth for water, not from the immediate surface, which might carry windblown debris, but from cleaner snow deeper in the drift. It's a slow way to hydrate, and it costs your body heat to melt each mouthful, but it's safer than drinking from unknown water sources which might be contaminated, or spending time and energy to melt snow over a fire you won't light. The entire meal takes perhaps 20 minutes. It's not satisfying in the way a hot meal would be, shared around a fire with companions, but satisfaction is not the point. The point is fuel. The point is continuation. As the grey dawn strengthens to a pale, watery daylight, you prepare to move. First, you must check your snares. You set 3 yesterday afternoon, simple noose snares, positioned along what looked like rabbit trails in the brush. They're made from braided sinew, with small twigs arranged to guide any passing animal into the noose. Winter rabbits are white now, nearly invisible against the snow except for their dark eyes and the shadow they cast. But they follow predictable paths, and you've been trained since childhood to see these patterns. You find the first snare empty and undisturbed. The second has been sprung, but whatever triggered it has escaped. The snow is trampled and there are tiny spots of blood, but no rabbit. Perhaps your knot wasn't tight enough. Perhaps the sinew was old and broke. You examine it carefully, resetting it with slight adjustments, filing the failure away in memory. The third snare holds a rabbit, frozen solid in death, still caught in the noose. Success. Fresh meat tonight if you dare to cook it, or more likely, another addition to your food bag, to be eaten raw or partially thawed over the course of tomorrow's travel. You reset all 3 snares. It costs you very little time, and you'll pass this way again. Perhaps on your return journey, perhaps not. But other scouts might follow your trail, and the tradition is to leave useful things for those who come after. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. Now comes the day's main work, movement and observation. Your objective on this journey, assigned to you by the Winter Chief before you left the main camp 8 days ago, is threefold. First, locate and track the winter movements of elk herds to the north and west. The camp needs to know where the hunting will be best when the deep freeze breaks enough for a hunting party to move safely. Second, watch for signs of other groups, other bands, perhaps friendly, perhaps neutral, perhaps hostile. Winter is a time when most peoples stay close to their own territories, but hunger makes people move in unexpected ways, and it's better to know who's moving where than to be surprised. Third, observe the condition of the forest itself, how deep the snow, how solid the ice on the rivers and lakes, whether there's been any sign of early thaw in the lower valleys. These are not glamorous objectives. No one will compose songs about you successfully reading deer tracks or noting that the ice on Blue Water Lake seems unusually thin this year. But these small pieces of information gathered by you and by the handful of other scouts spread across the territory become the mosaic of knowledge that keeps your people alive through the hungry months. You strap on your snowshoes, wood frames laced with sinew webbing, curved up slightly at the toe, spreading your weight across a larger surface so you don't sink helplessly into the deep snow with every step. Even with snowshoes, it's exhausting work. Each step requires lifting the shoe clear of the snow, swinging it forward, planting it with care to ensure it doesn't catch on hidden debris beneath the surface. Your legs burn with the effort within the first hour. By afternoon, they'll be numb with a different kind of cold, the deep muscle exhaustion that comes from sustained effort in brutal conditions. You travel northwest, following a ridgeline where the wind has scoured away some of the snow, making for slightly easier passage. The forest here is mixed: white pine, spruce, birch, standing bare-limbed and pale against the evergreens, the occasional oak that held some of its brown leaves through early winter, but has since given them up to the wind. The silence is profound. This is something people of the distant future will perhaps never quite understand. The true silence of a winter forest, unmarred by the drone of machinery, the hum of wires, the distant thunder of traffic. Here, silence is a physical presence. You can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, the soft creak of sinew on your snowshoes, the whisper of your robe against itself as you move. Sometimes a tree will release its burden of snow with a soft whump, and the sound carries so clearly in the cold air that you can hear it from a quarter-mile away. You're looking for tracks primarily, and you find them once you learn to see. Here, the paired prints of a snowshoe hare, its outsized hind feet landing ahead of its smaller front paws, the galloping pattern distinctive even in the blown snow. There, the delicate slots of deer hooves, the animal moving from one patch of low browse to another, stripping bark from saplings to eke out calories through the barren season. And there, and this makes you stop, crouch, examine carefully the pad and claw marks of a mountain lion, the tracks at least a day old, half filled with blown snow, heading east along the ridge before dropping down toward the valley. You note the direction carefully. Mountain lions are not typically aggressive toward humans, but they are opportunistic, and a solitary traveler is a different prospect than a group. You'll give that valley a wide berth for the next few days. Hours pass. The sun, when it appears at all through the high overcast, is a dim disk that provides light but precious little warmth. You judge it's perhaps mid-morning, the 3rd hour after dawn, when you find what you're looking for. Elk sign. Not just tracks, but a whole story written in the trampled snow. A herd, perhaps 15 or 20 animals, has moved through here sometime in the last 2 days. They've poured away snow to reach frozen grass beneath, leaving characteristic crater-like depressions. They've browsed the bark from aspen saplings, and they've bedded down in the lee of a small hill, melting the snow with their body heat to create ice-lined depressions where they rested. The tracks lead northwest, deeper into the valley system. This is valuable information. You mark the location carefully in your mind, that distinctive rock outcropping shaped like a hunched bear, the triple white pine growing from a single root ball, the particular curve of the frozen creek. These markers will allow you to guide a hunting party here, assuming the elk remain in the general area. You also note the condition of the herd from their tracks. The animals are moving slowly, conserving energy, which suggests they're not being pursued by wolves or human hunters. This is good. Stressed animals scatter and become harder to predict. By what you judge to be midday, the sun at its highest and weakest point, you've covered perhaps 8 miles. This sounds modest, but in snow, on snowshoes, checking every interesting track and sign, it represents substantial effort. Your body has found its rhythm now, that peculiar state where exertion and endurance balance out, where you're no longer particularly aware of your individual muscles because everything hurts equally. It's almost meditative, this long walk through cold and silence. You stop to rest at a place where a stream, frozen solid, cuts through the landscape. The ice is thick. You stamp on it experimentally with your snowshoe and it doesn't even creak. You scrape away surface snow and peer down through the clear ice. Sometimes you can see the dark shapes of fish suspended in the winter torpor below, but not today. The water must be deeper here, or perhaps the ice is too thick to see through clearly. You rest for perhaps 20 minutes, finding a log that's partially clear of snow, sitting with your back to the wind, eating another portion of pemmican and some of the parched corn. The corn is interesting. It was toasted before being traded to you, giving it a nutty flavor that's pleasant even though you're eating it dry and cold. Each kernel requires patient chewing, but it breaks the monotony of meat and fat. While you rest, you let your mind drift carefully through what you know and what you still need to learn. The elk are northwest. That's good. That's one objective being met. But you haven't yet found evidence of other human groups, and you haven't completed your circuit through the territory. You're perhaps 2 days from the northeastern boundary of your people's traditional winter range, where the land begins to transition from forest to more open country. That's where you're most likely to spot signs of other groups if anyone is moving in the deep winter. You should reach that boundary by tomorrow afternoon if your pace holds. Then you'll turn back, completing a rough circle that will bring you back to the winter camp in 4 or 5 more days, assuming nothing unexpected happens, assuming your body holds up, assuming you don't break through rotten ice or encounter an early blizzard or develop frostbite that turns serious, or meet with any of the 1,000 other small disasters that can transform routine hardship into actual crisis. As afternoon stretches toward early dusk, the sun, what little you've seen of it, already sinking toward the southwest, you begin looking for tonight's shelter location. This is an art in itself, one that takes years to develop. You need protection from wind, ideally a natural windbreak, like a rock face or dense evergreen grove. Access to fuel if you dare risk a small fire, though you likely won't. Proximity to water, even if frozen. A position that gives you some view of the surrounding area so you can spot anyone or anything approaching, but also a position that doesn't make you visible from a distance, that doesn't expose your silhouette on a ridgeline or make you the obvious feature in an otherwise empty landscape. It's a balance between security and concealment, between access and isolation. Too exposed and you're vulnerable. Too hidden and you might miss important signs. Too comfortable and you might grow careless. You find a possibility, a place where two large boulders lean together, creating a small cave-like space between them. Snow has drifted against the boulders, and with some digging, you could create a proper snow shelter, insulated by the very material you're sheltering from. There are pine boughs available nearby for flooring. A small frozen stream is within 100 paces, ice to melt for water. And the position is on a slight rise, giving you some view down the valley, but the boulders break your outline against the sky. You spend the next hour preparing the shelter, digging away some of the drifted snow to create a hollow between the boulders. Cutting pine boughs with your knife, a tool you've kept sharp with a small whetstone you carry, maintaining it with the same care you maintain your bow or your snares. Layering the boughs to create a platform that will insulate you from the frozen ground. Arranging more boughs overhead to create a roof that will trap some of your body heat while allowing moisture from your breath to escape. The work warms you, which is both good and dangerous. You begin to sweat, and sweat in winter is potentially deadly. Moisture against your skin that will freeze once you stop moving, stealing body heat at an alarming rate. You pace yourself carefully, working steadily but not frantically, periodically opening your outer layers to vent heat and moisture. By the time full darkness falls, and it falls early in winter, the sun giving up its brief daily attempt to warm the world, you have a functioning shelter. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but functional, adequate, enough. You sit in your shelter as darkness deepens, wrapped in your robe, eating your evening meal of dried meat and the wild rice you've been saving. The rice, boiled and dried before your journey began, requires patient chewing, but it's filling in a way that pure meat is not. The combination satisfies something in your body's hunger. The temperature is dropping rapidly with the sun gone. Your breath comes in clouds that shimmer briefly in the starlight before dissipating. The stars themselves, on clear nights like this, are almost overwhelming in their brightness and profusion. Every constellation you know is visible, along with the great clouded river of stars that stretches across the sky like a path. Some say that's the trail spirits walk when they leave this world. Others say it's simply an unfathomable multitude of distant fires. You don't know, but there's comfort in the wondering. The sounds of night begin. Far off, very far, you hear a wolf howl, a long, wavering note that carries across the frozen landscape. Wolves are vocal in winter, calling to their packmates, coordinating hunts across miles of territory. You're not concerned. Wolves generally avoid humans, and a healthy wolf pack has no reason to bother a solitary person who poses no threat to their kills or their territory. Still, you listen to the howling, trying to judge distance and direction. Knowledge is survival. Closer, you hear the sharp crack of a tree splitting in the cold. When sap freezes and expands, it can split wood like an axe blow, the sound sharp as a rifle shot, though of course you don't think in terms of rifles. Those weapons are still a rarity this far from colonial settlements, though you've heard of them, and you know that they're changing the nature of hunting and warfare in complicated ways. Change always comes like the seasons. You just try to pay attention to its direction. As you sit in the darkness, wrapped in your robe, your thoughts drift to the people you left behind. Not because you're lonely exactly. Loneliness is a luxury of people who have the option of companionship. You're simply alone, which is different. But you think of them, the winter chief who sent you on this journey, trusting your judgment and your skill, the family you were born into, who raised you to read the forest and the sky, the friends you grew up with, some of whom are scouts like you, others hunters, others skilled in crafts or diplomacy, or the spiritual practices that keep the community bound together. You think of the children too, the next generation, who watch scouts like you leave camp and wonder what it's like, who imagine it's adventurous and exciting rather than cold and repetitive and occasionally terrifying. They'll learn if they follow this path. Everyone learns, eventually, that endurance is less glamorous than it appears from a distance. You wonder sometimes what keeps you doing this. The answer isn't simple. Partly it's duty. Your people need scouts, need the information you gather, and you have the skills to provide it. Partly it's identity. This is who you are, who you've trained to be since adolescence. Partly it's a strange kind of pride in withstanding what must be withstood, in being reliable when reliability matters. And partly, though you'd never articulate this to anyone, it's something else, a peculiar relationship with solitude and landscape, with the stripped-down simplicity of winter travel where everything is reduced to its essentials: warmth, food, movement, attention. There's a clarity in this life that's harder to find in the more complicated social world of the winter camp. Here, the metrics of success are straightforward. You survive or you don't. You gather useful information or you don't, you return or you don't. It's honest in a way that much of life is not. You burrow deeper into your sleeping robe as full night settles over the frozen world. You won't truly sleep, not the deep, surrendered sleep of someone safe in a warm lodge. Instead, you'll drift in and out of a lighter state, your mind rising toward consciousness every hour or so, automatically checking your surroundings, listening for anything that sounds wrong or threatening or simply different. Your body knows how to do this now, after years of practice. It knows how to find rest, even in cold and discomfort, how to process the day's exertion while remaining alert enough to respond to danger. It's a skill like tracking or snare setting or reading weather signs in the sky. You've trained your body to operate in conditions that would incapacitate someone unused to them. The night deepens, the cold intensifies, the stars wheel slowly overhead in their eternal patterns. Somewhere out there, miles away through the forest, your people sleep in the relative warmth and safety of the winter camp. Fires burn low but steady. Families cluster together, sharing body heat, sharing stories, sharing the communal life that humans need to remain human. But you're here instead, a solitary consciousness in the vast winter dark, listening to the silence, watching over territory that your ancestors watched over, continuing a tradition so old that no one remembers when it began. Before there were scouts like you, there were others performing the same function under different names, and before them, others still, stretching back through time until the very concept of people and territory and watching emerged from something more primal. You are one link in an unbroken chain of attention and endurance. As sleep finally pulls you down into its shallow embrace, your last conscious thought is of tomorrow. Another day of walking, watching, gathering information. Another day of cold and solitude and the quiet competence that keeps your people alive. It's not an easy life being the one who goes ahead into the frozen unknown, but it's yours. And you'll wake tomorrow and do it again and again after that, until the information is gathered and the circuit complete, and you can finally turn your snowshoes back toward the smoke and voices of home. As the pale sun rises on another winter morning across the frozen territories of the northern woodlands, let us drift our attention away from the solitary scout and toward the figure who coordinates these invisible networks of watchers and walkers. Let us turn our gaze toward the winter camp itself, where leadership takes a different form than the solitary endurance we've been following. The smoke rises from the lodges in thin, wavering columns, not the thick billows of wasteful fires, but the careful, managed smoke of people who understand that fuel must last through months of cold. Among these lodges, one stands slightly larger than the others, not ostentatiously so, but enough to accommodate the gatherings that leadership requires. This is where we find Wabasha, whose name in his own Dakota language means red leaf, a man whose responsibilities in winter are as heavy as the snow that weighs down the pine boughs. But before we enter the warmth of that lodge, before we see him in the fullness of his authority, let us step back through time and watch how a leader is made, not born, but slowly shaped through experience, expectation, and the weight of other people's survival pressing down upon young shoulders. Wabasha was born in the winter of 1693 in a season much like the one we've been walking through, though several generations removed. He entered the world during what his people would later remember as the Year of Three Blizzards, when snow fell so heavily and so repeatedly that even the eldest couldn't recall its equal. His mother, laboring in a winter lodge while wind howled outside, brought him into a world that was, from his first breath, defined by cold and the human ingenuity required to survive it. His father held a position of respect, not quite a chief, but a senior hunter and advisor, someone whose counsel carried weight in decisions about when to move camp, where to hunt, how to manage relations with neighboring bands. From earliest childhood, Wabasha absorbed the rhythms of leadership not through formal instruction, but through observation. He watched his father sit quietly while others spoke, saw him weigh options with careful attention, noticed how he never rushed to judgment but allowed silence to settle before offering his thoughts. These were lessons that couldn't be taught directly. They had to be absorbed the way a child absorbs language, not through memorization, but through immersion in the patterns of speech around them. By the time Wabasha reached his 12th winter, he was already being trained for greater responsibilities. Not explicitly, no one sat him down and announced his destiny, but certain elders began including him in conversations that younger children were excluded from. He was sent on errands that required him to carry messages between senior members of the band, messages that taught him the complex web of relationships, obligations, and histories that bound the community together. He learned that leadership was not primarily about giving orders. It was about holding knowledge, knowing which families had old grievances that might flare up under the stress of hunger, knowing which hunters worked best together and which needed to be kept separate, knowing the carrying capacity of different territories in different seasons, knowing when to push forward and when to wait for conditions to improve. When Wabasha was 16, he experienced his first winter as a scout. This was standard practice. Young men of promise were sent out to learn what solitude and hardship could teach them, lessons that couldn't be absorbed around the communal fire. He went with an experienced scout, a man named Mapia Wikasta, whose name meant Cloudman, and who had been watching the winter territories for nearly 2 decades. Cloudman was not a talkative teacher. He didn't explain his decisions or justify his choices. He simply moved through the frozen landscape with practiced efficiency, and Wabasha had to learn by observation and imitation, when to dig a snow shelter and when to press on despite exhaustion, how to read the subtle textures of ice on a frozen lake to judge where it was safe to cross, which plants, even in their winter-dormant state, could provide emergency food if properly prepared, how to move through territory where other groups might be hunting without giving offense or appearing threatening. But the deepest lesson that winter, the one that would shape Wabasha's entire approach to leadership, came on a bitterly cold afternoon in the 3rd week of their circuit. They had been tracking a herd of elk, noting their movements for the hunters who would follow when weather permitted. The tracks led down into a narrow valley, and Cloudman stopped at the valley's rim, studying the terrain below with unusual intensity. Wabasha, impatient with youth, started to move forward. Cloudman's hand shot out, gripping his arm with surprising strength. The older man said nothing, just pointed with his chin toward the valley floor. Wabasha looked, but saw nothing concerning, just snow, trees, the elk tracks continuing down. They waited. Minutes passed, long enough that Wabasha began to wonder if Cloud Man had become overly cautious with age. And then, from the far end of the valley, movement. A line of figures emerged from the trees, another group, perhaps a dozen strong, moving on snowshoes following the same elk herd. Not Dakota. The way they moved, the configuration of their group suggested Ojibwe, possibly a hunting party from bands to the east. Cloudman and Wabasha withdrew silently, circling around the valley entirely, losing a day of travel but avoiding any potential confrontation. That night, as they prepared their shelter, Cloudman finally spoke. A dead elk feeds people for a week. Information about who hunts where feeds people for years. We are scouts, not hunters. Our harvest is knowledge, not meat. Wabasha never forgot those words, or the patience behind them. The willingness to wait, to observe, to gather information even when it cost time and effort. The understanding that small decisions, whether to press forward or hold back, could cascade into consequences that affected the entire band. By his mid-20s, Wabasha had become one of the most trusted scouts in his band's network. But increasingly, he was being kept closer to the winter camp, his role shifting from solitary observation to coordination and decision-making. The previous winter chief, an elder named Tetanwakantuya, had recognized something in the young man, a combination of patience, judgment, and the respect of his peers that made him suitable for greater authority. This transition was gradual, not marked by any single moment of appointment. It began with Wabasha being asked to help decide which scouts would cover which territories, a task that required intimate knowledge of both the land and the individuals. Some scouts worked best alone, thriving in solitude. Others needed the reassurance of working in pairs. Some had family situations that made long absences difficult. Some had injuries from previous seasons that limited their range. All of these factors had to be weighed. Then came the responsibility of interpreting the information the scouts brought back. A report of elk movements was never just a report of elk movements. It had to be understood in context. What did their location suggest about snow depth in different valleys? If elk were moving unusually far from their typical range, what might have displaced them? Were they being pursued by predators, wolves, or human hunters? Were they simply following food availability, or was something else driving their behavior? Wabasha developed a reputation for being able to synthesize these fragments of information into coherent understanding. He could listen to 3 different scouts describing conditions in 3 different areas and recognize patterns that others missed. He understood that information was not just data. It was a living thing that changed meaning depending on context and timing. By the winter of 1725, when Wabasha was 32 years old, he had fully assumed the role of winter chief. Tetanwakantuya had passed quietly in his sleep the previous autumn, a peaceful departure that everyone agreed was what the old man had earned after a lifetime of service. There was no formal ceremony of succession. The role had already become Wabasha's through years of gradual accumulation of responsibility and trust. But now the full weight settled on his shoulders. Every decision about scouts, who went where, when they should return, how to interpret their absence if they were overdue, was his to make. Every choice about when to send out hunting parties based on scout reports carried the potential for success or disaster. Every judgment about whether other groups in the territory posed threat or opportunity could cascade into conflict or alliance. And all of this happened during the season, when conditions were harshest, when mistakes cost the most, when the margin for error was thinnest. Wabasha's lodge became a place of quiet consultation. Scouts would return, sometimes frost-covered and exhausted, to report what they'd seen. Wabasha would listen with complete attention, asking occasional questions, not to challenge, but to clarify, to fill in details that the scout might not realize were important. He had learned from Cloudman to let silence do its work, to allow scouts time to remember details that didn't seem significant until they were voiced aloud. He kept no written records. His people's tradition was oral, knowledge preserved in memory and transmitted through careful teaching. But Wabasha's memory was capacious and precise. He could recall the patterns of elk movement from winters past, comparing them to current reports. He knew which frozen lakes had developed dangerous thin spots in previous years, warning scouts away from those areas. He remembered which families in neighboring bands had relatives in his own camp, knowledge that could smooth diplomatic encounters or prevent misunderstandings. The winter of 1738 tested everything Wabasha had learned. It began ordinarily enough. Cold settled early, snow fell in the usual patterns, and the scouts went out on their circuits as they had for generations. But in the second moon of deep winter, a scout named Takante returned 3 days earlier than expected, and his face carried news before his mouth spoke it. Wabasha received him privately, gave him warm food and a place by the fire, and waited while the younger man collected himself. Takante had been scouting the northeastern territories, the boundary lands where Dakota claims bordered against Ojibwe seasonal ranges. Usually these boundaries were respected. Winter was not a season for territorial disputes when survival demanded everyone's full attention. But Takante had found tracks, many tracks of a large group moving southwest from Ojibwe territory into the valleys that Dakota hunters were preparing to use. Not just tracks, but camps, hastily constructed shelters, the marks of multiple fires, evidence of a group perhaps 40 strong, too large to be a simple hunting party. They were moving with purpose, and their direction suggested they were either heading directly toward Wabasha's winter camp or toward the elk concentrations that his other scouts had reported just days before. Wabasha questioned Takante carefully. How old were the tracks? How fast was the group moving? Were there signs of women and children, suggesting a band in distress seeking shelter? Or was this composed entirely of fighting-age men? Had Takante gotten close enough to determine their exact number and composition, or was he estimating from track evidence? The answers painted a concerning picture. The group was moving quickly despite the snow, suggesting urgency or purpose. The tracks suggested primarily men, though in winter conditions it was difficult to be certain. They were perhaps 2 days ahead of Takante's position when he'd turned back to carry the warning. This meant they might arrive in the contested hunting valleys within 3 or 4 days. Dakota hunters were scheduled to depart for those same valleys in 5 days, once the current scouts completed their circuits and confirmed conditions. Wabasha faced a decision that would affect dozens of lives. He could assume peaceful intent. Perhaps the Ojibwe group was simply following game or seeking shelter from harsh conditions in their own territory. He could proceed with the planned hunt, perhaps sending a small diplomatic party ahead to make contact and negotiate shared use of the hunting grounds. This was the generous interpretation, the choice that assumed good faith and maintained the careful web of relationships between peoples who had to coexist across shifting seasonal boundaries. Or he could assume the worst, that this was a war party or at minimum a group willing to defend their claim to the hunting valleys with violence. He could delay the Dakota hunt, ceding the territory and forcing his own people to rely on cached food stores that might not last through the remaining winter moons. He could gather his own men and move to intercept the Ojibwe group, a confrontation that could turn bloody even if both sides entered it intending only to demonstrate strength. Or, and this was the path Wabasha ultimately chose, he could move the entire winter camp. It was not a decision made lightly or quickly. Wabasha spent an entire day in consultation, speaking with the elders who remembered previous boundary disputes, with the senior hunters who knew the land intimately, with the women who managed the camp's food stores and could calculate how long supplies would last with different hunting scenarios. He sent runners to bring back 2 other scouts who were still in the field, wanting their assessment before committing to such a significant choice. Moving a winter camp was enormously costly. Every lodge had to be dismantled, every cache of stored food relocated, every family displaced from the relative comfort and routine they'd established. The elderly would suffer most. Cold was hard on aging bodies, and the stress of movement could turn a manageable winter into a deadly one. Children would be at risk during the travel. And if Wabasha was wrong, if the Ojibwe group was peaceful or turned aside before reaching the contested valleys, then he would have imposed all this hardship unnecessarily. But if he was right, if conflict came to the valley and Dakota hunters were caught in a confrontation far from the protection of the main camp, the consequences could be catastrophic. Hunters killed or injured, diplomatic relationships shattered, potential for revenge cycles that could last years, and all for a few weeks' access to elk herds that, while valuable, were not the only food source available to those willing to adjust their plans. Wabasha made his decision on the evening of the second day after Takante's return. The camp would move south into a valley that was less ideal for hunting, but more defensible and farther from the disputed boundary. Scouts would maintain watch on the Ojibwe group's movements, gathering information without making contact. The Dakota hunters would shift their focus to other game in other territories. And if the Ojibwe party proved peaceful, if they eventually withdrew, or if diplomatic contact could be made safely, then adjustments could be made later when more information was available. It was a conservative choice, prioritizing safety over opportunity. Some of the younger hunters grumbled. They wanted to defend the traditional hunting grounds, to demonstrate that Dakota presence in those valleys was not negotiable. But the elders supported Wabasha's judgment, and in winter the elders' voices carried particular weight. They remembered winters when boldness had cost lives, when territory held with violence had to be abandoned anyway, when casualties left bands too weak to defend what they'd claimed. The move took 4 days. Wabasha insisted on careful pacing, frequent rest stops, constant attention to the elderly and the children. He moved through the column of travelers, checking on families, making sure no one was left behind or struggling unseen. Leadership in these moments was not about grand strategy or diplomatic cleverness. It was about noticing when a child's feet were too cold, about redistributing loads so that no one family bore too much burden, about making sure that the scouts ranging ahead and behind kept the column safe without pushing so far forward that they lost contact. At night, when the temporary camps were established and most people had settled into exhausted sleep, Wabasha walked the perimeter alone, checking the watchfires, confirming that the scouts had reported in, thinking through contingencies. He slept lightly those nights, his mind never fully at rest, always half listening for the particular sound of alarm or distress. The Dakota band established their new winter camp in a valley his father had used decades before, a place Wabasha remembered from childhood. It was less abundant than the northern valleys they'd left behind, but it was also more sheltered, easier to defend, and far enough from the boundary that they could hunt without constant vigilance for other groups. Meanwhile, scouts continued to monitor the Ojibwe party. Reports trickled back over the following weeks. The group had indeed occupied the northern valleys, had hunted the elk herds intensively, and had shown no sign of pushing further into Dakota territory. They seemed to be dealing with their own crisis, a particularly harsh winter in their home territory that had forced them to range unusually far in search of game. After 3 weeks, the Ojibwe party withdrew back toward their own lands, laden with meat from successful hunts. They had, as far as scouts could determine, never even realized that Dakota families had been camped just 20 miles to the north, or that their movement had triggered a major relocation. Some in Wabasha's band suggested he had overreacted, that they could have stayed in the original camp without incident, but others, particularly those who remembered previous winters when territorial disputes had turned violent, praised his caution. The elderly especially were grateful. The move had been hard, but it had been survivable, and they'd done it with time to prepare, rather than in panicked flight from immediate danger. Wabasha himself drew a different lesson, one he would carry through all his remaining years of leadership. Information was valuable only when acted upon with wisdom. Takante had brought accurate intelligence. There was indeed a large group moving into contested territory. But the information alone couldn't dictate the response. That required judgment, consultation, willingness to accept criticism, and the courage to make choices that others might question. Leadership, he understood more deeply than ever, was not about being right in the moment. It was about making decisions that kept possibilities open, that preserved the band's strength and cohesion, that erred on the side of caution when the stakes were survival itself. What made Wabasha's leadership effective, beyond his personal judgment, was the network of trust he maintained with his scouts. These men, occasionally women though less commonly, were the eyes and ears that made informed decisions possible. And Wabasha understood that trust was not automatic, not simply granted by his position. It had to be earned continuously through recognition of their hardship, respect for their skill, and careful attention to their welfare. When scouts returned from long, cold journeys, Wabasha made sure they received good food first, rest second, and only then debriefing. He knew what they'd endured because he'd endured it himself. He never asked for more than he knew a scout could give, and he never minimized the difficulty of what they'd accomplished. When a scout named Wihaka, elk, returned with frostbitten fingers after an emergency journey through a sudden blizzard, Wabasha personally tended him, applying the salves that could prevent permanent damage, sitting with him through the painful nights when the frostbite thawed and healed. Wihaka recovered, fingers intact, and remained one of Wabasha's most loyal scouts for the next 15 winters. But more than that, every other scout saw how their leader treated one of their own in crisis, and that observation reinforced the bond of mutual obligation that held the network together. Wabasha also understood that scouts needed to feel their information mattered, that their hardships produced results. So he made a practice of sharing back with them how their reports had been used, what decisions had been enabled by their observations. When a scout reported on river ice conditions and that intelligence prevented a hunting party from attempting a dangerous crossing, Wabasha made sure the scout knew his work had likely saved lives. When another scout's careful tracking of wolfpack movements allowed hunters to avoid areas where competition for game would be fierce, that scout learned his attention to detail had tangible value. This feedback loop, scouts gathering information, Wabasha synthesizing and acting on it, scouts learning their work mattered, created a system that was more than the sum of its parts. It transformed isolated individuals enduring hardship into a coordinated intelligence network that gave the entire band significant advantages in survival and planning. But for all the support Wabasha received from his scouts and advisors, there remained aspects of leadership that were irreducibly solitary. The final decisions were his, the weight of consequences rested on his shoulders. And there were moments, particularly deep in winter, when darkness came early and stayed late, when that burden felt almost unbearable. He would sit sometimes in his lodge, long after others had gone to sleep, staring into the low fire, turning over decisions in his mind. Had he deployed scouts optimally? Should he have sent Takante east instead of north, or vice versa? Was there information he'd missed, patterns he'd failed to recognize? When scouts were overdue, a common occurrence in winter when storms could delay travel by days, he would wrestle with when to send a search party and when to wait, knowing that sending searchers too soon risked more lives, but waiting too long could mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. The hardest moments came when scouts didn't return at all. It was rare, but it happened. A fall through ice, a sudden blizzard that disoriented even an experienced traveler, an encounter with predators or hostile strangers, the collapse of a snow shelter, the simple, quiet failure of a body pushed past its limits. Winter claimed lives, even among those who knew its dangers intimately. When a scout named Maza, Iron, failed to return from a circuit during Wabasha's 10th winter as leader, the search parties found him a week later, curled in a snow hollow, frozen. The best they could determine was that he'd broken through weak ice, crossing a stream, had gotten thoroughly soaked, and hadn't been able to generate enough warmth to survive the following night. His shelter had been competently built, his gear properly maintained. He'd simply encountered conditions that exceeded his body's capacity to endure. Wabasha felt that loss personally. He questioned whether he should have sent someone else on that circuit, someone younger perhaps, or whether he should have insisted on pairing scouts during that particularly cold stretch. The elders counseled him that winter claims lives, that this had always been so and would always be so, that leadership didn't mean preventing all loss, only minimizing it and ensuring the losses weren't meaningless. But knowing this intellectually and accepting it emotionally were different things. Wabasha carried Meza's memory and the memory of others lost over the years as weights he couldn't fully set down. He sometimes wondered if this was the real cost of leadership, not the decisions themselves, but the accumulation of grief for all the consequences that couldn't be prevented, all the people who trusted your judgment and paid for circumstances beyond anyone's control. As the years passed, Wabasha became one of the most respected winter chiefs in Dakota memory. His band survived harsh seasons that devastated others. His network of scouts became a model that other leaders studied and emulated. His judgment in crisis became the stuff of stories told to young people learning what leadership meant. But Wabasha himself remained modest about his accomplishments. When younger leaders sought his advice, he would speak not of his successes but of his mistakes, the lessons learned through error and consequence. He emphasized patience, consultation, and the willingness to gather information before committing to action. He stressed that the scout's role, the person enduring hardship to bring back knowledge, was as essential as the leader's role in using that knowledge wisely. In his later years, as his own body aged and the hardships of winter affected him more severely, he began training his successor, much as Xitanwakantuya had trained him, not through explicit instruction, but through gradual inclusion in decision-making, through modeling of judgment and patience, through the slow accumulation of trust and responsibility. He often thought about that winter when he was 16, when Cloudman had stopped him at the valley's rim and taught him that scouts harvest knowledge, not glory. That single lesson, offered without elaboration in the cold afternoon light, had shaped everything that followed. It had taught him that leadership was about enabling others to do their work well, about creating systems where information flowed and decisions reflected collective wisdom rather than individual heroism. On this particular winter evening, years after the crisis of 1738, years into his leadership, but not yet at the end of his story, Wabasha sits alone in his lodge after the last scout has reported in. The fire burns low, carefully banked to last through the night, without waste. Outside, the temperature drops toward levels that make exposed skin dangerous within minutes. But here, insulated by hides and bark and the warmth of his thoughts, he is comfortable enough. He thinks of the scouts out in the territories right now, the ones who won't return for days yet. He pictures them in their snow shelters, wrapped in their robes, eating cold food and listening to the night sounds of the winter forest. He remembers what that solitude feels like, the strange clarity it brings, the way it strips away everything inessential and leaves only the stark mathematics of survival. He hopes they're safe. He's deployed them as wisely as he knows how, sent them to territories they know well, made sure they have adequate supplies and appropriate equipment. But hope is all he can offer them now. They're beyond his protection, beyond anyone's help except their own skill and the small mercies of weather and chance. This is the bargain of winter leadership. You send people into danger because their courage and suffering purchase safety for others. You ask them to endure hardship so that the many can survive. You place them in situations where your authority cannot shield them, where their fates rest entirely on their own competence and the whims of conditions you cannot control. And they go because they trust you, because you've proven through seasons of consistent judgment that you don't waste their efforts or spend their lives carelessly, because they know you understand what you're asking of them, having endured it yourself. Because the alternative to this system, everyone ignorant, everyone blind to threats and opportunities beyond their immediate camp, is worse. Wabasha adds another small piece of wood to the fire, watches it catch and flare briefly before settling into steady combustion. The light flickers across the interior of his lodge, casting shadows that dance and merge. Outside, wolves howl in the distance, their voices carrying across the frozen landscape. He wonders if his scouts hear them too, if they're calculating distance and direction, noting the information in their memories to report when they return. If they return? When they return. The slip between those two words, between the certainty and the uncertainty, is where leadership lives, in that narrow space between what you can control and what you cannot, between wisdom and chance, between the decisions you make and the consequences that follow. He pulls his robe tighter, settles into a more comfortable position, and lets his mind drift towards sleep. Tomorrow will bring its own demands, its own decisions, its own small crises and necessary judgments. But for now, in this moment between waking and rest, he allows himself a quiet satisfaction. His people are as safe as his knowledge and judgment can make them. His scouts are deployed with wisdom and care. The network of attention and endurance that keeps everyone alive through winter is functioning as it should. It's enough. For tonight, it's enough. The fire burns lower. The shadows deepen. And in his lodge, and in snow hollows scattered across miles of frozen territory, the representatives of a people adapted to hardship settle into the watchful rest that winter demands of those who would survive it. Let us drift now into a different kind of territory. Not the physical landscape of forest and frozen water, but the landscape of mystery and lost knowledge. Let us consider what vanishes when winter melts, what traces disappear so completely that even those who search for them centuries later find almost nothing. Modern archaeology is a discipline built largely on permanence, on the things that last. Stone tools that survive millennia, pottery shards that resist decay. The post holes of ancient structures, dark stains in the soil that mark where wooden poles once stood, fire pits lined with stone, their arrangement revealing patterns of habitation and use, middens filled with discarded shells and bones, testament to what people ate and how they lived. But what of the traces that don't last? What of the knowledge systems and material practices that were designed, almost by necessity, to leave no permanent mark? What of the winter scout whose entire purpose required him to move through the landscape like wind through grass, present in the moment, gone without evidence? This is the peculiar challenge that archaeologists face when they try to understand the winter lifeways of pre-colonial peoples in the northern forests and plains. The summer camps, the autumn hunting sites, the spring fishing stations, these often leave identifiable traces: fire rings, tool caches, worn trails, concentrations of worked stone or bone. Even after centuries, a trained eye can read these signatures in the landscape. But winter? Winter scouts? The people who moved alone or in small groups through frozen territories, deliberately avoiding fires, building temporary shelters from snow and branch that would collapse and disappear with the first thaw. These people are nearly invisible to archaeological methods. They moved through history like ghosts, leaving only the faintest suggestions of their presence, hints that require imagination as much as evidence to interpret. Imagine, if you will, a winter shelter built by a scout in January of 1740. The location has been chosen with care, a small depression sheltered by evergreen boughs, positioned to break the prevailing wind, near enough to water but not so close as to risk the dangerous cold that settles over ice on clear nights. The scout has dug into a snowbank, creating a hollow perhaps 4 feet deep, 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, just large enough for a single person to curl within. The floor is lined with spruce boughs arranged in overlapping layers to create insulation from the frozen ground. More boughs overhead create a lattice that supports snow and provides a rough roof. The entrance is small, just large enough to crawl through, positioned to minimize wind infiltration. The entire structure takes perhaps 90 minutes to construct, using only a knife, a hatchet, and knowledge passed down through generations of winter travelers. Inside this shelter, the scout passes a night, perhaps 2 nights. His body heat, trapped by the snow walls and the buffalo robe wrapped around him, raises the interior temperature to a level that, while far from comfortable, is survivable. He eats cold food, drinks melted snow, and sleeps in the shallow, vigilant way that winter scouts must sleep. Then with dawn or the day after, he moves on. The shelter remains empty now, a small cavity in the snow. What happens next? The wind redistributes loose snow, gradually filling the hollow. Fresh snowfall adds layers. The temperature fluctuates, warming during the day, freezing at night, and the structure begins to collapse under its own weight. The boughs that formed floor and roof become buried, compressed, gradually decomposing under the weight of ice and snow. By the time spring comes, the entire structure has melted away. Water soaks into the ground or runs off toward the nearest creek. The boughs, freed from snow, lie scattered. Within weeks, they're indistinguishable from the normal accumulation of forest debris, fallen branches, shed needles, the constant small decay that characterizes any woodland. By summer, even someone who knew exactly where to look would find nothing. No post holes, no firing, no permanent structure. The ground shows no signs of having been occupied. The vegetation grows back undisturbed. The shelter has returned to the elements it was borrowed from, leaving no trace except in the memory of the person who built it. And memory, of course, is precisely what fades most completely over time. But the scouts did leave signs, intentional signs meant to be read by others who knew the language. This is one of the most fascinating and frustrating aspects of studying winter scout practices. The evidence suggests sophisticated systems of communication and marking that were designed to be temporary, to fade naturally, to avoid permanent alteration of the landscape. Consider the practice, documented in various oral histories and fragmentary observations by early traders, of using bent branches to convey information. A scout moving through territory might pause at a trail junction and carefully bend a young sapling, not breaking it, but applying steady pressure until the wood fibers stretched and the branch remained pointing in a particular direction. This wasn't random. The direction of the bend indicated which path the scout had taken. The height of the bend might indicate how long ago the scout had passed. The type of tree chosen, willow versus birch for instance, might convey information about what the scout had observed, game sign, water sources, potential dangers. These bent branches would remain visible for days or even weeks, long enough for another scout following behind to read them. But then spring would come, and the saplings, being young and flexible, would gradually straighten as they grew. By the next winter, the bent branch would be indistinguishable from any other tree in the forest. The message had been delivered, read, and erased by natural processes. Or consider the practice of arranging stones or sticks in particular patterns. A scout might pause to create a small cairn, not a permanent structure, but a casual-looking arrangement of a few rocks that nonetheless conveyed specific meaning to those who knew how to read it. 3 stones in a line might indicate direction. 4 stones in a square might warn of danger. Stones topped with a stick, pointed in a certain angle, might encode more complex information about what lay ahead. But how does one distinguish centuries later between stones arranged with intentional meaning and stones that happen to lie in a pattern by pure chance? How does an archaeologist look at a landscape covered in rocks and identify the tiny percentage that once carried messages? The answer, frustratingly, is that they mostly can't. Without the context of the living tradition, without someone who learned the system of signs from their elders, the markings become indistinguishable from background noise. In recent decades, a smaller number of archaeologists have become interested in what they call the archaeology of ephemera, the study of temporary, seasonal, and deliberately impermanent aspects of past human behavior. These researchers work at the boundary between archaeology and anthropology, combining physical evidence with oral histories, documented observations, and creative interpretation. One such researcher, working in the Boundary Waters region between what is now Minnesota and Ontario, spent several winters learning from Indigenous elders about traditional winter travel practices. Then, with permission and in collaboration with local communities, she attempted to reconstruct winter scout shelters and movement patterns, documenting what traces these activities left and how quickly those traces disappeared. Her findings were illuminating. A snow shelter, she discovered, leaves almost no trace once melted, but there are subtle signatures if you know what to look for. Compressed soil where the floor had been, a slight circular depression that might persist for a single growing season before being obscured by vegetation. Occasionally, the spruce boughs used for flooring would remain partially preserved if conditions were right, identifiable by their characteristic pattern of needles and their concentration in an area that otherwise showed no obvious reason for such accumulation. She also experimented with trail markers. Bent branches, she found, were indeed readable for weeks after being created, but straightened within a single growing season in most cases. Stone arrangements could persist much longer, years or even decades, but were easily disturbed by natural processes, frost heave, animal activity, the simple expansion and contraction of soil through freeze-thaw cycles. Most tellingly, she calculated that even if every single winter scout shelter and trail marker from a century of winter travel were perfectly preserved, they would still represent less than 1% of the archaeological signature that the same population left during their spring, summer, and autumn activities. The winter world, by its very nature, was designed to leave minimal trace. This was partially practical, minimizing the work required to create shelter, but also cultural. There was value in moving through the landscape lightly, in not imposing permanent changes, in allowing the land to reclaim itself after each season. Occasionally, very occasionally, winter conditions themselves preserve things that otherwise would have vanished. In 1997, hikers in the mountains of what is now British Columbia discovered something extraordinary: the partially preserved remains of a winter shelter, exposed by melting snow and ice. Carbon dating suggested it was approximately 400 years old. What made this shelter visible when thousands of others had disappeared without trace? A combination of unusual circumstances. The shelter had been built against a rock face in an area of permanent snowpack. After the scout, or whoever built it, had left, more snow had fallen, burying the structure deeply. But instead of melting come spring, the snow had persisted, compressed into ice, creating a microclimate that preserved organic materials that normally would have decayed. When archaeologists carefully excavated the site, They found remnants of the spruce bough floor, still identifiable after 4 centuries. They found traces of what had likely been a hide robe, though it was too degraded to preserve. They found something even more extraordinary, a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be fire-starting materials, fungus tinder, a piece of iron pyrite, fragments of dry grass. This suggested that even scouts who didn't dare light fires during their travels still carried the capability, a kind of emergency preparedness for situations where concealment mattered less than survival. The site was documented, studied, and then allowed to melt back into the landscape, a respectful acknowledgement that its preservation had been an accident of conditions, not an intention of its builder. But for the brief time it was visible, it offered a window into practices that otherwise existed only in oral tradition and fragmentary historical observations. Understanding Winter Scout practices becomes even more complex when we consider their spiritual dimensions. Many indigenous traditions don't make hard distinctions between practical and spiritual actions. The two are interwoven, each supporting and giving meaning to the other. A trail marker might be simultaneously a navigation aid and a prayer. A shelter might be oriented not just for practical reasons of wind protection, but also in accordance with spiritual principles about directions and their meanings. Some oral traditions speak of scouts leaving small offerings as they traveled, a pinch of tobacco placed on a stone, a brief prayer spoken to the spirits of the place, a small carved figure left at a site of particular power or danger. These practices served multiple purposes. They maintained respectful relationship with the spiritual landscape, they potentially offered protection to the traveler, and they marked the scout's passage in a way that was meaningful to the community, even if invisible to outsiders. But how would such practices appear in the archaeological record? A pinch of tobacco decomposes and disperses within days. A spoken prayer leaves no physical trace. A small wooden figure might survive if conditions were exactly right, but would more likely rot away within a season, indistinguishable from any other fallen branch. Even if such an object were found, how would an archaeologist recognize it as an intentional offering rather than a random piece of shaped wood? This is where archaeology reaches its limits. The material record can tell us about the physical traces of human activity, but it struggles to capture meaning, intention, and belief. It can document that people traveled through winter landscapes, but it cannot easily reconstruct what that travel meant to them, what stories they told themselves about it, what spiritual preparation they undertook before departing, what prayers or songs sustained them during the long, cold nights. Another challenge in understanding Winter Scout practices is simply the question of scale. Consider if a people numbering perhaps 5,000 individuals sent out 20 scouts each winter, and each scout built perhaps 15 temporary shelters during a circuit lasting 3 weeks, that's 300 shelters per winter. Over a century, that's 30,000 shelters. Over the several centuries before European contact fundamentally disrupted these patterns, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of temporary winter structures built, used, and abandoned across the northern forests and plains. And yet how many have been identified and studied by archaeologists? Perhaps a dozen, maybe fewer, depending on how strictly we define identification. The vast majority have simply vanished, melted back into the landscape from which they were briefly borrowed, leaving no trace that survives the slow erosion of time. This creates a kind of paradox. We know these practices were widespread, sustained, and critically important to the survival strategies of many peoples. We have oral histories, we have documented observations from early European traders and explorers, we have continuity of knowledge in some indigenous communities where winter survival skills have been maintained or revived. But we have almost no physical, archaeological evidence. The practices were real, but they're invisible to the primary method we use to study the past. It's as if an entire dimension of human experience simply fails to register in the usual archives of history. Not because it wasn't important, quite the opposite. but because its very nature was ephemeral. Some scholars have begun to argue that absence itself can be a form of evidence. If we know from other sources that Winter Scout practices were widespread, and if we can demonstrate that such practices would leave minimal or no archaeological trace, then perhaps the very lack of evidence becomes meaningful. Perhaps the blank spaces in the archaeological record aren't simply gaps in our knowledge, but accurate reflections of practices that were designed to be impermanent. This is a subtle shift in thinking. Instead of asking, where is the evidence for Winter Scouts, we ask, what would the absence of evidence tell us about the nature of their practices? The answer might be, it tells us they were skilled at moving through the landscape without permanent alteration, that they valued temporary shelter over permanent structures, that their relationship with the winter environment was one of careful negotiation rather than domination or transformation. In a sense, the near invisibility of Winter Scouts in the archaeological record is itself a testament to their skill and their cultural values. They managed to survive, even thrive, in conditions that would kill unprepared travelers, and they did so while leaving almost no permanent mark on the landscape. That's not a failure of their material culture, it's a success of their adaptation. What makes the study of Winter Scout practices possible at all is that the knowledge didn't entirely disappear. In some communities, the traditions were maintained, adapted, and passed down through generations despite enormous disruptions. In other communities, knowledge that had faded is being actively recovered through conversation with elders, through experimentation, through careful study of the fragmentary historical record. Contemporary indigenous people who practice traditional winter survival skills can describe in vivid detail the sensations and challenges that scouts would have faced, the particular way cold penetrates damp clothing, the mental discipline required to maintain alertness through long solitary nights, the subtle art of reading snow conditions to determine where travel will be easier or harder, the quiet satisfaction of building adequate shelter from minimal materials. This living knowledge provides context that no archaeological excavation could recover. It reminds us that the scouts weren't simply enduring hardship, they were practitioners of a sophisticated set of skills that required years of training and deep understanding of their environment. They were reading a landscape that most modern observers would see as blank and featureless, finding meaning in subtle variations of snow texture, tree spacing, wind patterns, and animal behavior. When elders teach these skills to younger generations today, they're not just transmitting practical survival knowledge, they're maintaining a connection to ancestors who moved through the same landscapes, solved the same problems, and understood the winter world in ways that are increasingly rare in modern experience. And so we're left with a mystery that cannot be fully solved. What was it really like to be a winter scout in the generations before European contact? We can reconstruct the practical aspects reasonably well, the clothing, the tools, the shelter techniques, the food preservation methods. We can understand the strategic importance of the role and the social structures that supported it. We can even, to some extent, imagine the physical sensations and challenges, but there are dimensions we can't fully recover. The spiritual preparation before departure. The mental strategies for coping with isolation and cold. The stories scouts told themselves during long, dark nights. The dreams they had in their shallow, vigilant sleep. The particular quality of awareness that comes from days of solitude in a landscape that offers both profound beauty and genuine danger. The internal experience of being trusted with your people's safety, of carrying knowledge that might mean the difference between survival and starvation. These aspects of winter scout life remain tantalizingly out of reach, preserved in no material archive, recorded in no written document, knowable only through imagination informed by whatever fragments of knowledge survive in oral tradition and lived experience. Perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to be held passed person to person, generation to generation, rather than fixed in permanent form. Perhaps the winter scouts who moved through the landscape, leaving minimal trace, who built their shelters from snow that would inevitably melt, who marked their paths with signs that would naturally fade, would not have wanted their practices to be permanently archived and studied by strangers centuries later. Or perhaps they would have been pleased to know that even now, even after so much has been lost and forgotten, people still wonder about them, still try to understand what they accomplished, still feel the pull of those cold, quiet journeys through winter landscapes. Close your eyes for a moment, or let them rest softly if you're drifting towards sleep, and imagine you could somehow observe a winter scout from 300 years ago, not to interact, just to watch quietly, invisibly, as they move through a day. You see them wake in the pre-dawn cold, breath misting in the dim light. You watch them work frozen moccasins until the leather softens. You observe the careful, economical movements as they pack their few possessions, erase the signs of their shelter, and begin the day's journey. You follow as they read tracks in the snow, noting details that you wouldn't have noticed, the age of the tracks, the health of the animal that made them, the direction of travel, the implications for hunting. You watch them pause at a trail junction and carefully bend a young tree, encoding a message you can't quite interpret. You see them travel for hours without breaking rhythm, their pace sustainable but relentless, covering distance while conserving energy. You observe them building their evening shelter with practiced efficiency, each movement purposeful, no energy wasted on unnecessary refinement. And then, as darkness falls and they settle into their buffalo robe, wrapped in their snow hollow, you see something else. The particular quality of alertness they maintain even in rest, the way their consciousness doesn't fully surrender but remains tuned to the sounds and sensations that might signal danger or opportunity. You realize that what you're watching isn't just a set of survival techniques. It's a completely different way of being in the world, a mode of awareness and relationship with the environment that requires total presence and attention. And then you open your eyes, or let your consciousness drift back toward your own warm bed, and you realize that person, that scout, moved through their world with the same intensity of aliveness that you move through yours. Their challenges were different, their dangers more immediate, their comforts fewer, but their fundamental humanity, their capacity for courage and skill and endurance was the same. They lived, they struggled, they succeeded more often than they failed, or they wouldn't have survived to pass their knowledge forward. They experienced cold and hardship that would disable most modern people, and they did it routinely, repeatedly, because their communities depended on them. And they did all of this while leaving almost no trace, while moving through history like wind through winter grass, present in the moment, felt in their effect, but gone without permanent evidence. Perhaps there's something valuable in this absence, this near invisibility of winter scout practices in the permanent archaeological record. Perhaps it reminds us that not all important human activities leave traces that survive centuries. Perhaps it suggests that our understanding of the past is necessarily incomplete, full of blind spots and blank spaces where significant experiences happened but cannot now be fully recovered. This is humbling, in a good way. It reminds us that for all our sophisticated methods of studying history, for all our technologies of preservation and analysis, there are dimensions of past human experience that remain mysterious, knowable only through imagination informed by the fragments that survive. It also reminds us that impermanence isn't necessarily a flaw or a failure. The Winter Scouts' shelters were temporary because temporary was adequate, and perhaps even preferable. Why invest energy in permanent structures when your presence in any given location would be measured in hours or days? Why mark the landscape permanently when your people's relationship with that landscape was based on respectful, sustainable use rather than permanent alteration? The modern world has a bias toward permanence, toward leaving lasting marks, toward structures and systems that endure. But the Winter Scouts remind us that there's another way. To move through the world lightly, to use what you need without taking more than necessary, to shelter yourself adequately without claiming territory permanently, to communicate what needs to be communicated, and then let the messages fade when they're no longer needed. As this segment comes to a close, let your mind rest with these images. Snow falling silently on abandoned shelters, gradually filling and erasing the evidence of occupation. Trees straightening slowly after being bent to mark a trail, the message delivered and no longer needed. Stones arranged with careful meaning, then scattered by frost and time until the pattern is lost. Paths through snow that melt come spring, leaving no trace on the ground beneath. Think of the winter scouts moving through these landscapes, carrying knowledge that couldn't be written down, practicing skills that couldn't be fully preserved in any archive except the lived tradition passed from teacher to student, elder to young person, generation to generation. Think of them building shelters that would last only days, leaving signs that would fade naturally, moving through the world in ways that minimize their permanent impact while maximizing their effectiveness. And think of how much we've lost, all the knowledge and experience that faded like snow in spring, all the wisdom that was never recorded because it was meant to be lived rather than archived. But think too of what survives, the fundamental human capacities for endurance, adaptation, and skillful relationship with difficult environments. These didn't disappear when the specific practices faded. They remain latent in every person who faces hardship with courage, who learns to read their environment with attention, who discovers that they're capable of more than they imagined. The Winter Scouts are mostly gone from the archaeological record, vanished as completely as their snow shelters, but their legacy persists in a different archive, in the continuing traditions of indigenous communities who remember and honor these practices, in the stories told around winter fires about ancestors who endured and excelled, in the quiet knowledge that humans have always been capable of extraordinary adaptation and resilience. Let that knowledge be a comfort as you drift deeper toward rest. You are connected through the long chain of human generations to people who faced winter with courage and competence, who developed sophisticated skills for surviving in conditions that seem almost unimaginable to us now, who did it all while maintaining respect for the landscape and the life it sustained. Their snow shelters have melted, their trail markers have faded, but the essential knowledge that humans can adapt, can endure, can find meaning even in hardship, that remains as permanent as anything humans create ever is. Rest now. Let the mystery of these vanished practices wash over you like snow-covering tracks. Let the absence of evidence remind you that not everything important needs to be preserved permanently. Some things are meant to fade, to return to the elements they came from, leaving only the faintest suggestions of their presence. The Winter Scouts understood this. They built their shelters knowing they would collapse. They marked their trails knowing the marks would fade. They moved through the landscape knowing they would leave almost no permanent trace. And perhaps in that acceptance of impermanence, they understood something profound that we're still learning, that the value of an action doesn't depend on how long it lasts, that some of the most important things we do leave no permanent mark, that presence in the moment can be more valuable than persistence through time. Sleep well, knowing that you too are part of this impermanent world, where experiences matter even when they don't last, where the snow falls and melts, where messages are delivered and fade, where shelters are built and abandoned and reclaimed by the landscape, and where through it all humans continue to adapt, to endure, to find meaning in the temporary and the ephemeral. Let us turn now from the solitary figure in the snow, from the ephemeral shelters and fading traces, and direct our attention back to the winter camp itself. But this time, we won't observe the ordinary families huddled in their lodges, nor the hunters preparing for the next expedition. Instead, let us step quietly into the larger lodges, the ones positioned strategically near the center of the camp, where the winter chief resides, where medicine people conduct their ceremonies, where elders gather to share knowledge and make decisions that will shape the community's fate. This is a different world from the one we've been exploring, though separated by only a few dozen paces. Here, fire burns more freely, food is more abundant. Clothing is richer, more layered, more carefully crafted. The daily routines still involve hardship. Winter spares no one entirely, but the hardship is mediated by status, by accumulated resources, by the labor of others, and by the privileges that communities grant to those whose responsibilities are deemed most essential. It would be easy to present this as simple inequality, as exploitation or unfairness. But the reality, as with most aspects of pre-colonial indigenous life, was more nuanced. Status brought privileges, yes, but it also brought obligations that were binding and inescapable. The winter chief, who enjoyed a warmer lodge and more reliable food, also bore the weight of every decision about scout deployment, hunting party timing, and resource allocation. The medicine person who received choice portions of meat also carried responsibility for maintaining the spiritual health of the entire community through ceremony and healing. The elders who sat closest to the fire also served as living libraries, repositories of knowledge that took lifetimes to accumulate and that could be lost entirely if not carefully transmitted. Let us explore this world with the same gentle attention we've given to the scout's solitary journey, understanding that privilege and burden are often two faces of the same coin, and that even in warmth and relative comfort, winter exacts its price. The lodge where Wabasha resides during the deep winter months is perhaps twice the size of a typical family dwelling. This isn't ostentation, it's necessity. The winter chief must be able to receive scouts at any hour, must host councils with elders and senior hunters, must have space for the arrival of messengers from other bands or the occasional diplomatic visit from neighboring peoples. The lodge is, in effect, a combination of residence, headquarters, and community gathering place. The structure itself represents weeks of labor, most of it performed the previous autumn when weather still permitted such work. The frame is substantial, poles of strong, straight wood, carefully selected and shaped, lashed together with sinew and hide strips in patterns that distribute weight and resist wind stress. The covering consists of multiple layers. First, sheets of birch bark, harvested in late spring when the bark peels most easily from the trees. Over this, carefully tanned hides, elk, deer, buffalo, each one representing hours of scraping, treating, and softening by skilled hands. The seams where hides meet are sealed with a mixture of pine pitch and animal fat, creating a barrier against wind and moisture. The floor is lined first with bark, then with layers of woven mats made from cattail reeds, then with furs, bear, buffalo, wolf, creating insulation from the frozen ground that could otherwise leach body heat at an alarming rate. Around the central fire pit, which is carefully constructed with a ring of stones to contain the flames and reflect heat, there are designated spaces, sleeping areas to the rear, storage areas along the sides and near the entrance, a space left relatively open for gatherings and councils. The fire itself burns almost continuously throughout the winter. This is one of the clearest markers of elite status, the ability to maintain a steady, warm fire without constant anxiety about fuel depletion. Firewood has been cached throughout the autumn by hunters and young men performing their community obligations, stacked in covered areas near the lodge, where it remains relatively dry even through winter storms. The wood has been selected for quality, hardwoods that burn hot and long with minimal smoke, rather than the fast-burning softwoods that poor families might have to rely on when better fuel runs short. The result is a space that, while never truly warm by modern standards, is at least comfortable. The temperature inside might hover around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the outside air drops far below zero, a profound difference that affects everything from sleep quality to the body's ability to fight off illness. Wabasha wakes not to frigid darkness and the need to immediately begin generating body heat through movement, but to the low glow of banked coals and the relative comfort of layered furs. His sleeping robes are numerous and of high quality: buffalo hides, bear furs, several layers of woven rabbit fur blankets that provide extraordinary insulation while remaining relatively light. He has, in effect, a bed that would have been the envy of all but the wealthiest Europeans of the same era. But comfort is not the same as ease. Before Wabasha even fully wakes, his mind is already engaging with the day's responsibilities. Which scouts are expected to return today? Have there been any reports of illness in the camp that might require his attention? What decisions need to be made about the next hunting expedition? Are there disputes that need mediating, resources that need redistributing, ceremonies that need planning? He rises slowly, not from laziness, but from a learned understanding that sudden movement in cold, even moderate cold, can stress aging joints and muscles. Wabasha is in his 50s now, an age that in his time and place represents genuine elderhood. His body bears the marks of decades of winter survival. Old frostbite scars on fingers and toes, a knee that aches in cold weather from an injury sustained years ago, the general stiffness that comes from a lifetime of sleeping on the ground, even when that ground is lined with furs. His first act, even before dressing, is to add wood to the fire. This is something he does himself, despite having family members who could do it for him. There's a principle at work here, one that good leaders understand. Status doesn't mean complete exemption from ordinary tasks. A leader who never tends his own fire, who never performs basic camp maintenance, who allows himself to become completely dependent on others for all physical needs, gradually loses connection with the daily realities his people face. Wabasha learned this from watching leaders who failed, who became so insulated by their status that they could no longer make sound judgments about what ordinary people could realistically accomplish or endure. So he tends his fire, coaxing the coals back to flame, adding kindling and then larger pieces of wood until warmth begins to radiate properly. Only then does he dress, not in the utilitarian, purely functional clothing a scout would wear, but in garments that communicate status while still providing protection from cold. His clothing is layered and rich, each piece representing not just function, but also the social relationships and obligations that define leadership. The innermost layer is a shirt of soft deerskin, tanned to suppleness and worn smooth from years of use. Over this, a tunic decorated with quill work, dyed porcupine quills applied in geometric patterns that required dozens of hours of meticulous labor. The woman who created this garment, a master craftswoman in the band, gave it to Wabasha not as a commercial transaction but as recognition of his leadership and as a statement of her own skill and status. His leggings are similarly decorated with additional protection for the knees where wear is heaviest. His moccasins, while structurally similar to what a scout might wear, are more elaborately decorated and better maintained. He has multiple pairs that he rotates, allowing each to fully dry between wearings, a luxury that scouts in the field cannot afford. Over all of this, when he ventures outside, he wears a robe that is simultaneously practical and symbolic. The hide is buffalo, but not just any buffalo. This came from a particularly large bull, hunted during a successful expedition that Wabasha himself participated in years ago. The hide was tanned by his wife, a process that took weeks of labor, and then painted with symbols that record important events in Wabasha's life and in the band's recent history. Anyone familiar with the visual language can read this robe like a book, seeing references to successful hunts, to winters survived, to diplomatic achievements and spiritual experiences. This robe is heavy, perhaps 15 pounds, But that weight is itself a form of insulation, and it announces status in a way that doesn't require words. When Wabasha walks through the winter camp wrapped in this painted buffalo robe, everyone who sees him recognizes not just his position, but also the web of relationships and accomplishments that position represents. After dressing and eating a breakfast that includes dried meat, but also cached corn, dried berries, and even a small amount of maple sugar, luxuries that represent either trade goods or the preferential distribution of scarce resources, Wabasha begins his primary work, listening and deciding. The first visitor is an elder woman, a grandmother who has noticed that one of the young families in camp seems to be running low on food. Their cache, carefully prepared in autumn, has depleted faster than expected, possibly because they underestimated their needs, possibly because of a mishap that ruined some of their stores, possibly because they've been sharing with others who had even less. The elder doesn't come to complain or demand. She simply presents the information, knowing that Wabasha will need to make a decision about resource redistribution. This is one of the constant grinding challenges of winter leadership. The band's collective food stores are finite. Every decision to give to one family means less available for others, or for the unpredictable emergencies that might arise in the remaining winter weeks. If Wabasha is too generous, the whole community could face shortages. If he's too restrictive, people could starve while adequate food sits unused in storage. He must balance immediate need against future uncertainty, individuals suffering against collective survival. He thanks the elder for the information and promises to investigate personally later in the day. This too is important. Status doesn't mean making decisions in isolation, based purely on second-hand reports. Good leaders verify information, see conditions with their own eyes, maintain personal connection with the daily struggles of their people. The next visitor is a scout who returned late last night, too exhausted to give a full report, but needing to deliver urgent information. Wabasha offers him a seat near the fire, an honor, an acknowledgement of the hardship the scout has endured, and listens as the young man describes what he's observed. Signs of a large wolf pack ranging closer to camp than usual, suggesting that prey animals might be scarcer than normal, which would affect hunting prospects for the coming weeks. Wabasha asks careful questions. How many wolves? How recent were the signs? What condition did the track suggest the pack was in? Well-fed or desperate? Were there signs that the wolves had made successful kills recently, or were they ranging widely in search of prey? Each answer helps build a more complete picture, helps inform decisions about where to send the next hunting party, whether to alter patrol patterns, what precautions to recommend for anyone venturing away from camp. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of people seeks Wabasha's attention. A dispute between two families over a borrowed tool that was broken and not properly replaced. A request from the Medicine Society for additional resources to conduct a healing ceremony for a child who has developed a persistent cough. A question from a group of hunters about whether conditions are right for a proposed expedition to a valley 3 days' travel away. Each situation requires judgment. The disputed tool, Wabasha must determine whether the borrower is obligated to provide a replacement or whether the lender should accept the loss, considering the circumstances of how the tool broke and the relative resources of both families. The ceremony. He must balance the genuine need for spiritual intervention with the practical costs of the materials the ceremony will consume. Tobacco, sage, certain foods, items that have value, and alternative uses. The hunting expedition. He must synthesize information from multiple scouts, consider the hunter's capabilities, weigh the potential benefits against the risks, and make a call that could mean the difference between needed protein for the camp or the loss of valuable hunters to injury, cold, or other dangers. These aren't simple calculations. They require deep knowledge of people, of the land, of weather patterns, of resource availability, of social dynamics. They require wisdom that comes only from years of experience and observation. And they require the ability to make difficult choices, knowing that not everyone will be satisfied, that some will privately, or not so privately, question his judgment, that the consequences of error could be severe. This is the hidden cost of elite status, the constant grinding responsibility of making decisions that affect others' lives. Wabasha's warmer lodge and better food compared with the weight of these judgments, with the sleep interrupted by worry, with the knowledge that his mistakes could kill people, while his successes will often be taken for granted. In another substantial lodge, positioned to catch the first morning light, lives a figure of different but equally important status, a woman named Wihaka, whose name means she who dreams. Her role as a medicine person combines elements that modern categories struggle to capture. She is part healer, part spiritual advisor, part keeper of esoteric knowledge, part psychologist, part herbalist. Her lodge is smaller than Wabasha's, but equally well appointed, with particular attention to the storage and organization of her materials. Hanging from the lodge poles are bundles of dried herbs, each one carefully harvested at the right season and prepared according to specific protocols. Sage for purification ceremonies, sweetgrass for prayers and blessings, echinacea roots for fighting infection, willow bark for fever and pain, yarrow for wounds, dozens of other plants, each with their uses, each requiring specific knowledge about when to harvest, how to prepare, what dosages to use, what conditions respond to which treatments. Along one wall are pouches containing mineral substances, particular clays known for their healing properties, ochre for ceremonial painting, crystals and stones that carry spiritual significance. In carefully wrapped bundles are the tools of her practice, rattles made from gourds filled with seeds or pebbles, drums of various sizes for different ceremonial purposes, pipes for sacred smoke, knives for cutting herbs or making ceremonial marks, needles of bone for certain healing techniques. Wihaka's training began in childhood, when elders recognized in her a particular aptitude, a sensitivity to plants and their properties, an ability to remember complex herbal combinations, dreams that seemed to carry genuine insight rather than mere random imagery. She apprenticed for years with older medicine people, learning not just the practical applications of herbs, but also the songs, prayers, and ceremonies that accompanied their use. In her tradition, healing is never purely physical. It always involves spiritual dimensions, relationships between the patient and the broader web of existence. Winter presents particular challenges for healing work. Many of the most effective herbs are unavailable fresh. They must have been gathered, dried, and stored during warmer months. Some remedies that work well in summer prove less effective in winter when patients' bodies are stressed by cold and reduced nutrition. Wounds that would heal quickly in warm weather become prone to infection when the body's resources are devoted primarily to maintaining core temperature. But winter also brings its own specific health challenges that require Wihaka's attention. Respiratory illnesses that spread through close-packed lodges where multiple families share space and air. Frostbite ranging from mild to severe, requiring different interventions depending on the degree of tissue damage. Depression and spiritual malaise that can afflict people during the long, dark months when sunlight is scarce and activity restricted. Injuries from ice falls or accidents during winter travel, malnutrition-related conditions when food stores run low or lack dietary diversity. Wihaka's typical winter day involves a combination of direct patient care, preventive work, and spiritual practice. She might spend an hour treating a child's persistent cough with steam inhalation using specific herbs added to heated water, teaching the mother how to continue the treatment. Then she'll visit an elder suffering from joint pain, providing both herbal remedies and gentle manipulation of the affected areas, techniques learned from generations of practitioners. Later, she might conduct a ceremony for a family seeking blessings for an upcoming hunting expedition, creating sacred space through smoke, prayer, and the invocation of protective spirits. Her status is marked not by decorated clothing or political authority, but by the respect people show when they enter her lodge, by the gifts they bring when seeking her help, a portion of meat, a well-made basket, a particularly beautiful hide. These aren't payments in a commercial sense, but acknowledgements of reciprocal obligation, ways of maintaining balance in relationships. Near the center of the winter camp, in a lodge that shows signs of many years of careful maintenance, lives an elder named Tokala, Wolf, who has reached the remarkable age of 72 winters. In an era when infection, injury, accident, and the simple wearing down of bodies under hard use commonly limited lifespans to 40 or 50 years, Tokala's survival is itself a testament to some combination of good fortune, strong constitution, community support, and perhaps spiritual favor. Tokala is no longer physically capable of hunting, scouting, or most of the demanding labor that winter survival requires. His hands are gnarled with arthritis, his hearing has diminished, his vision clouds slightly in both eyes. But his value to the community has not diminished. If anything, it has intensified with age. He is a living library, a repository of knowledge accumulated across 7 decades of close observation. He remembers winters from his childhood that were harsher than any in recent memory, and his recollections help contextualize current conditions. Is this winter unusually difficult, or are people simply forgetting how hard winter normally is? He recalls the locations of hunting grounds that haven't been used in decades, but that might still be viable if conditions force the band to range more widely. He knows the genealogies of multiple bands, information crucial for maintaining diplomatic relationships and avoiding inadvertent insults based on forgotten kinship connections or historical grievances. Most importantly, Tokala is a master storyteller, and in winter, stories are not mere entertainment, they're educational technology, ways of encoding and transmitting complex information in memorable form. Through stories about ancestors who faced various challenges, Tokala teaches problem-solving strategies, ethical principles, survival techniques, and social values. A story about a foolish young hunter who ignored warnings and suffered consequences carries practical lessons about risk assessment. A story about a generous leader who shared resources and was later saved by the loyalty his generosity earned teaches principles of reciprocity and community maintenance. Tokala's lodge is frequently full of visitors, particularly in the evenings when work is done and people gather for warmth and companionship. He sits wrapped in furs near his fire, a fire that, like Wabasha's, burns steadily, maintained by younger people who recognize that keeping elders comfortable is not just kindness but social investment. And he talks, his voice perhaps not as strong as it once was, but still capable of capturing attention, of painting vivid pictures with words, of making the past live in ways that inform the present. His status is subtle, no elaborate clothing, no political authority, no ability to make binding decisions. But when Tokala speaks in council, people listen with particular attention. When he offers advice, leaders take it seriously. When he expresses an opinion about proposed actions, that opinion carries weight earned through decades of proven judgment. He is wealthy in respect, in attention, in the warm place by the fire that his community ensures he occupies. The lives of these elite figures, the winter chief, the medicine person, the respected elder, exist in stark contrast to the life of the scout we followed in earlier segments. Where the scout endures cold, they enjoy relative warmth. Where the scout eats sparingly from limited portable supplies, they have access to more abundant and diverse food. Where the scout sleeps in vigilant, shallow rest in a temporary snow shelter, they sleep in warm lodges on thick furs. But the contrast, while real, is not the whole story. These privileged positions come with their own forms of hardship that are psychological and social rather than purely physical. Wabasha bears the weight of life and death decisions for his entire community. Wihaka carries responsibility for healing that she knows sometimes exceeds her capabilities. There are illnesses she cannot cure, injuries she cannot mend, and each failure leaves its mark on her spirit. Tokala feels the burden of being one of the last living links to knowledge that might die with him if not successfully transmitted to the next generation. Moreover, the relationship between elite and common, between privileged and laboring, is not one of simple exploitation. The scout who endures cold and hardship relies on the winter chief's judgment about where to scout and when to return. The winter chief relies absolutely on the information the scout brings back. The medicine person treats everyone, scout and chief, wealthy and poor, respecting only the severity of need and the patient's willingness to follow prescribed treatments. The elders' stories benefit everyone who listens, transmitting knowledge that serves the community as a whole rather than hoarding wisdom for the benefit of the few. This is a complex social system where different roles carry different privileges and different burdens, but where the roles are understood to be interdependent. The winter camp survives not because any single person is extraordinary, but because the system as a whole functions, because each role is fulfilled with competence, because privileges are balanced, however imperfectly, with obligations. As daylight fades, and it fades early, in the deep winter, the sun giving up its battle with darkness by mid-afternoon, the winter camp settles into its evening routines. Smoke rises from every lodge, though the quantity and quality vary with the resources each family commands. Sounds carry clearly in the cold air. Children's voices, though more subdued than in summer. The thunk of someone splitting wood, the scrape of a hide being worked, dogs barking as they settle for the night. Occasional laughter from a lodge where people have gathered to share stories and companionship. In Wabasha's lodge, a small council is gathering. Present are Wihaka, the medicine person, Tokala the elder, several senior hunters and their wives, and 2 scouts who returned today with information that needs discussing. They sit in a rough circle around the fire, and Wabasha begins by inviting the scouts to share what they've observed. The room listens with complete attention as details emerge. Elk movements, ice conditions on distant lakes, signs of potential rival groups in borderlands, weather patterns suggested by cloud formations and animal behavior. Then discussion begins. The hunters offer their assessment of what the scout reports mean for hunting prospects. Wihaka mentions health concerns, several cases of respiratory illness that might worsen if conditions remain very cold, suggesting the band might benefit from successful hunting that would allow for richer, more nourishing broths. Tokala recalls a winter decades ago when similar scout reports preceded an especially harsh, cold snap, suggesting that current patterns might follow similar trajectories. This is collective decision-making, with Wabasha's role being not to dictate but to synthesize, to ensure all voices are heard, to ask clarifying questions, and ultimately to articulate the consensus, or, when necessary, make the final call when consensus can't be reached. It's a sophisticated process that respects both expertise and experience, that values practical knowledge from scouts and hunters equally with the wisdom of elders and the spiritual insights of medicine people. The council lasts perhaps 2 hours. Decisions are made about the timing and location of the next major hunt, about sending a diplomatic messenger to a neighboring band to share information about conditions, about redistributing some food stores to families running low, about conducting a ceremony to seek favor for the community as winter deepens. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make compelling narrative in an action-oriented sense. Just the steady, careful work of managing a community's survival through difficult times. When the council ends, people disperse back to their own lodges. Wabasha remains by his fire, as he often does, thinking through the decisions, considering what he might have missed, planning for contingencies. His wife, a woman of considerable status herself, both as partner to the winter chief and as a master craftswoman whose skills in hide tanning and quill work are widely respected, begins preparing their evening meal. She works quietly, competently, adding this and that to a pot warming near the fire. Dried meat, cached vegetables, herbs for flavor, working with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from decades of experience. They eat together in comfortable silence, a couple who have shared so many winters that words are often unnecessary. Outside, the temperature continues to drop. The stars emerge in crystalline clarity, the kind of sharp, brilliant display that only occurs in the coldest conditions. Somewhere in the surrounding forest, a scout sleeps in a snow shelter, wrapped in his robe, vigilant even in rest. In the camp, families settle in for the night, fires banked, children bundled between parents for warmth. The next morning, as Wabasha is dressing and planning his day, one of yesterday's scouts appears at his lodge. But this time, the young man doesn't carry information about elk herds or distant camps. Instead, he carries a question, and it's the kind of question that reveals the human dimension beneath all the social structures and survival strategies. The scout, his name is Kaski, meaning firstborn son, has been scouting winters for 3 years now. He's proven capable, reliable, willing to endure hardship without complaint. But this morning, he sits by Wabasha's fire and admits something that few scouts would voice. He's struggling with the isolation, not the physical hardship. He can manage cold, hunger, exhaustion. But the long days and nights alone, the silence that sometimes feels oppressive rather than peaceful, the sense of disconnection from the warmth and companionship of the camp, this is not a crisis, not yet. But it could become one if not addressed. A scout who loses mental resilience, who allows loneliness to erode his judgment and vigilance, becomes less effective and potentially dangerous to himself and to the community that relies on his information. Wabasha listens without judgment. He doesn't dismiss Kaski's feelings or tell him to toughen up. Instead, he shares his own experiences from his years as a scout, acknowledging that the isolation is real, that it's difficult, that not everyone is suited for this work, and there's no shame in recognizing one's own limits. He talks about techniques some scouts use to manage the loneliness, carrying small carved figures that remind them of home, singing softly to themselves, maintaining routines that create structure even in solitude. Then he offers Kaski a choice: continue scouting but perhaps on shorter circuits or in pairs with another scout, or transition to other roles where his skills could serve the community differently. There's no pressure, no implication that one choice is better than the other. Just recognition that different people thrive in different roles, and that wise leadership means matching people to tasks where they can succeed rather than forcing everyone into the same mold. Kaski leaves after an hour, visibly relieved to have voiced his struggle and to know that his leader understands and supports him regardless of what he chooses. This conversation, this kind of attentive leadership, is as important to the community's survival as any decision about when to hunt or where to send scouts. It's the maintenance of human relationships and morale that allows the practical systems to function. As this segment draws toward its close, consider the full complexity of elite life in the winter camp. Yes, there are material privileges, warmer lodges, better food, finer clothing, freedom from the most physically demanding labor. These privileges are real and significant. The difference between a winter chief's comfort and a scout's hardship is the difference between sleeping warm and sleeping cold, between eating well and eating adequately, between having support nearby and being utterly alone. But the privileges come packaged with responsibilities that are heavy in different ways. The physical burden of cold and hunger is straightforward. Your body either endures or it doesn't. The psychological burden of constant decision-making, of knowing that your choices will determine whether people live or die, of carrying responsibility for an entire community's welfare through the harshest season. This is a different kind of weight, harder to see from outside, but no less real to those who bear it. Wabasha will never experience the physical extremity that his scouts endure regularly, but he will carry weights they don't, the knowledge of which families are struggling, the need to balance competing legitimate needs with limited resources, the anticipation of crises that might still come, the memory of past decisions and their consequences, the grinding constancy of being the person others look to for answers. Wihaka will sleep warm and eat adequately, but she will also sit vigil with the dying, will try treatments she knows are unlikely to work because trying is better than abandoning hope, will carry the weight of esoteric knowledge that took decades to accumulate and that she must somehow pass on before it's lost. Tokala will enjoy the best seat by the fire, but he will also feel the urgency of time running out, will struggle to remember details that once came easily, will wonder if he's transmitting wisdom successfully or if crucial knowledge is slipping away despite his efforts. These are different hardships than what the scout faces in his snow shelter, but they are hardships nonetheless. The winter camp is not divided simply into comfortable elite and suffering commoners. It's a complex community where different roles carry different privileges and different burdens, where everyone, from the loneliest scout to the most respected elder, is engaged in the same ultimate project, making it through winter alive, maintaining the social bonds and accumulated knowledge that define the community, and emerging in spring ready to continue the cycles of life that have sustained their people for generations beyond counting. Let your mind rest now with this image of balance, imperfect balance, always negotiated, always slightly unstable, but balance nonetheless. The scout in the snow and the chief by the fire are not opposites, but complementary parts of a whole system. Each makes the other's role possible. The scout's hardship purchases information that enables wise decisions. The chief's judgment ensures that the scout's hardship serves meaningful purposes rather than being wasted on pointless errands. The medicine person's healing maintains the health of scouts and chiefs alike. The elders' stories transmit the knowledge that allows everyone to understand their roles in larger contexts. This is not a perfect system. There were surely scouts who felt their hardship was unappreciated, chiefs who made poor decisions, medicine people whose treatments failed, elders whose knowledge wasn't adequately transmitted. Systems composed of humans are never perfect because humans themselves are imperfect, limited in knowledge, subject to error, influenced by emotions and relationships in ways that don't always serve optimal outcomes. But imperfect systems can still be functional. They can still sustain communities through harsh conditions. They can still embody values of reciprocity, respect, and mutual obligation that make life bearable even when conditions are difficult. They can still create spaces where different kinds of human excellence, the endurance of the scout, the wisdom of the chief, the healing skill of the medicine person, the memory of the elder, are all recognized and valued. As winter deepens and the cold intensifies, as scouts range through frozen territories and chiefs deliberate by warm fires, as medicine people tend to the sick and elders share their stories, the winter camp persists. Not through any single person's heroism, but through the steady functioning of a complex social system where privileges and burdens are distributed, where different roles serve different functions, where the whole remains greater than the sum of its parts. And in the morning, when smoke rises from every lodge and people emerge wrapped in robes to face another day of winter, they do so not as isolated individuals, but as members of a community bound together by mutual dependence, shared knowledge, and the simple necessity of cooperation in the face of conditions that would kill those who tried to face them alone. The winter wind blows across the camp, bitter and relentless. But inside the lodges, some warmer than others, some better provisioned, some more comfortable, human life persists, maintained by the intricate web of relationships and responsibilities that define what it means to be a people rather than merely a collection of individuals. Rest in that knowledge, let it ease you towards sleep, this understanding that humans have always organized themselves in complex ways to face hard challenges, that privilege and burden often intertwine, that survival requires not just individual endurance, but collective systems, imperfect but functional, maintained through generations by people who understood that their fates were linked, that no one survives winter entirely alone. We have traveled far together through this winter night, you and I. We began in the frozen pre-dawn darkness with a solitary scout, feeling the stiffness in cold moccasins, tasting the metallic bite of frigid air, experiencing the peculiar solitude of being alone in a landscape of snow and silence. We followed that figure through days of vigilant travel, through the small rituals of survival, through the quiet discipline required to endure hardship without complaint or witness. Then we shifted our attention to Wabasha, the winter chief whose network of scouts formed invisible threads connecting the winter camp to the broader landscape. We watched him make decisions that balanced immediate needs against future uncertainties, that weighed individual suffering against collective survival. We saw how leadership in winter was not about command or glory, but about patient synthesis of information, about bearing the weight of consequences, about maintaining the human systems that allowed a community to persist through the harshest season. From there, we drifted into mystery, into the archaeological puzzle of practices that leave no permanent trace, of knowledge encoded in bent branches and snow shelters that melt come spring. We contemplated the strange paradox of absence as evidence, of how some of the most important human activities resist preservation, existing only in the ephemeral present before dissolving back into the landscape that briefly sustained them. And finally, we returned to the winter camp to observe a different kind of winter experience. The relative comfort of elite status, yes, but also the particular burdens that status imposed. We saw how privilege and responsibility intertwined, how the warmest lodge and the best food came paired with the weight of decisions that could cost lives, with the burden of specialized knowledge that must be maintained and transmitted with the constant awareness of being the person others depended upon. 4 segments, 4 perspectives on winter survival, 4 windows into a world that existed for thousands of years before the transformations of European contact fundamentally altered the patterns of life across North America. Different experiences, different hardships, different privileges, but all part of the same larger story of human adaptation to cold, to scarcity, to the necessity of cooperation in the face of conditions that would overwhelm those who faced them alone. Lie quietly now and consider the distance between that world and this one, between the scout's snow shelter and your warm bed, between cached pemmican eaten cold and the abundance of food available to you with minimal effort, between the uncertainty of winter survival and the comfortable predictability of your climate-controlled environment. The distance is vast, almost incomprehensible. Those winter scouts and chiefs and medicine people and elders lived in a world where cold was not an inconvenience to be managed with a thermostat adjustment, but a constant presence to be negotiated, where hunger was not a missed meal, but a genuine threat that required careful planning and disciplined resource management to avoid, where isolation meant true solitude, unmarked by any electronic connection, where darkness was complete except for fire and starlight. They could not have imagined your world with its casual abundance and its technological protections against cold and hunger and isolation. The gap between their daily experience and yours is so profound that even our careful attention over these past hours can only approximate what their lives felt like, can only gesture toward rather than fully capture the texture of their reality. And yet the distance is not absolute. Beneath all the technological and material differences, something fundamental remains constant. They were human in exactly the way you are human. They felt cold the same way you feel cold when you step outside on a winter morning, though they felt it more often and more intensely. They experienced hunger the same way you experience hunger, though their hunger was often more pressing and less easily satisfied. They knew love, concern, worry, satisfaction, pride, shame, courage, fear, the full range of human emotion in forms you would recognize instantly if you could somehow meet them across the centuries. Their challenges were different from yours, their daily lives organized by necessities you rarely face. But the underlying experience of being alive, of navigating the gap between what you hope for and what circumstances allow, of balancing personal needs against obligations to others, of finding meaning in hardship and satisfaction in competence, these are universal human experiences that connect you to them despite all the material differences. There is wisdom in these winter stories, knowledge that transcends the specific historical moment and speaks to something more permanent about the human condition. Winter, in the world we've been exploring, was a season that stripped away everything inessential. It demanded efficiency, competence, cooperation, and the kind of clear-eyed realism that understands both what's possible and what isn't. The scout learned to move through the landscape with minimal resources, to find shelter in temporary structures, to maintain vigilance even in exhaustion, to endure isolation without losing purpose. These are all metaphors, if you wish to read them that way, for capabilities that remain valuable even in your temperature-controlled, food-abundant, constantly connected modern life. The ability to function with less than you'd prefer, to create adequate solutions rather than waiting for perfect ones, to maintain focus despite discomfort, to be alone with your thoughts without dissolution. Wabasha learned, or perhaps we should say, Wabasha embodied, the principle that leadership is not about personal glory, but about enabling others to do their work well, about gathering information before deciding, about bearing the weight of responsibility without complaint, about understanding that your decisions will never satisfy everyone, but must be made anyway. These too are lessons that transcend their specific historical context, that speak to anyone who finds themselves in positions where others depend on their judgment. The winter camp as a whole demonstrated that survival under difficult conditions requires complex social organization, that privilege and burden often balance in unexpected ways, that no one role is sufficient. Scout and chief, medicine person and elder, hunter and craftsperson all contribute essential elements to the collective project of making it through harsh times. And the ephemeral nature of winter scout traces teaches perhaps the most subtle lesson, that not everything important needs to last forever, that temporary solutions can be perfectly adequate, that leaving a light footprint can be as much a mark of skill as creating permanent monuments, that some knowledge lives best in practice and memory rather than in permanent archives. As you lie in your warm bed, perhaps pull your covers a little tighter, feel the softness of your mattress, the warmth of your blankets, the security of walls and roof and heating system that keep winter at bay. Feel, too, a quiet gratitude for the distance between your life and the lives we've been contemplating. You will not wake before dawn to work frozen moccasins until they're soft enough to wear. You will not eat cold pemmican while sitting in a snow shelter, listening to the wind and the distant howling of wolves. You will not carry the weight of decisions that determine whether your community survives the winter. You will not sit by a fire wondering if you've successfully transmitted knowledge that took a lifetime to accumulate. These are not your challenges. You face different ones, shaped by different circumstances, no less real to you, but different in their texture and their demands. And that's okay. Every era, every culture, every individual faces the particular challenges their time and place present. There's no hierarchy of difficulty, no competition about whose hardships are more legitimate or more worthy of recognition. But there can be perspective. There can be the quiet satisfaction of recognizing that your ancestors, whether literal genetic ancestors or simply the broader human ancestors we all share, faced extraordinary challenges and found ways to not merely survive, but to thrive, to maintain complex cultures, to pass knowledge forward, to find meaning and even joy in circumstances that seem almost unbearably harsh from your comfortable vantage point. You are the beneficiary of thousands of years of accumulated human ingenuity, of technologies and systems and knowledge that people like those winter scouts and chiefs gradually developed and refined and transmitted forward. The warm bed you're lying in, the abundance of food available to you, the medical knowledge that keeps you healthy, the social systems that provide security. All of these rest on foundations built by generations of people who solved problems, who adapted to challenges, who figured out how to live in difficult conditions. You are their heir, the recipient of their accumulated gifts. And one way to honor that inheritance is simply to appreciate it, to feel genuine gratitude for the distance between their hardship and your comfort, to recognize that your ease was purchased by their effort, transmitted across generations through patient teaching and careful preservation of knowledge. The winter scouts are gone now, vanished as completely as their snow shelters. The specific individuals we've been imagining, that anonymous scout checking his frozen snares, Wabasha deliberating by his fire, Wihaka preparing her healing herbs, Tokala sharing his stories, all of them returned to the earth long ago, their bodies decomposed, their individual stories forgotten, except in the broadest outlines. But what they knew, what they practiced, what they embodied, this hasn't entirely disappeared. It lives on in changed form, in the continuing traditions of indigenous peoples who maintain winter survival skills and honor the memory of those who came before, in the archaeological evidence that hints at practices even when it cannot fully document them, in the oral histories that preserve fragments of knowledge about how people lived and what they valued, in the very fact that human populations successfully inhabited North America's northern regions for thousands of years, despite conditions that would quickly kill unprepared travelers. They left you and all of us the gift of demonstration, the proof that humans can adapt to extraordinary circumstances, that we are capable of more resilience and ingenuity than we usually need to demonstrate that cooperation and social organization can create capabilities far beyond what isolated individuals could achieve. They left the gift of humility, the reminder that our current ways of living are not the only possible ways, not necessarily the best ways, just different ways adapted to different circumstances and different values. The Winter Scouts didn't fail to invent central heating. They created different solutions to the problem of winter cold, solutions that worked for thousands of years and that had their own elegant efficiency. They left the gift of perspective, the ability to recognize that our current challenges, real as they are, exist in a broader context of human experience that includes far greater material hardship faced with far fewer resources. This doesn't invalidate your struggles. Your challenges are real and deserve recognition, but it can perhaps make them feel more manageable when you remember what humans have historically proven capable of enduring. And they left, perhaps most importantly, the gift of connection, the reminder that you are part of an unbroken chain of human generations, that the people alive 10,000 years ago were as fully human as you are, that the fundamental capacities for courage, ingenuity, cooperation, and endurance that they demonstrated are still present in you, latent perhaps, rarely called upon in your comfortable life, but they're nonetheless part of your inheritance as a human being. The night is deep now and you've traveled far through these winter stories. Your body is relaxed, your breathing slow and steady, your mind drifting in that pleasant state between waking and sleeping, where thoughts become less linear, more associative, where the boundaries between story and dream begin to blur. Let the images from tonight's journey drift through your consciousness without trying to hold them or organize them. The scout in his snow shelter, wrapped in his buffalo robe, listening to the silence. Wabasha by his fire, weighing information from multiple scouts, feeling the weight of decision. The bent branch marking a trail, slowly straightening as spring arrives. The medicine person's hands preparing herbs with practiced precision. The elder's voice telling stories that encode generations of wisdom. The winter camp with smoke rising from its lodges, people gathered around fires, the community persisting through the cold. These images are gifts offered to you across the centuries, windows into ways of life that are gone but not forgotten, hardships that were real but survivable, communities that were imperfect but functional, humans who were different from you in their circumstances but identical in their essential humanity. Let them ease you towards sleep, these stories of winter survival. Let them remind you of human resilience, of the ingenuity our species has always shown in the face of challenge, of the comfort of knowing that harder times than these have been endured and overcome by people who had far fewer resources than you possess. One final thought before sleep claims you completely. Every winter, no matter how harsh, has always ended. The scouts who endured those frozen journeys knew this with certainty. The winter chiefs who made difficult decisions about resource allocation knew this. The families huddled in their lodges knew this. Spring would come. The snow would melt. The ice would break up on the rivers and lakes. The geese would return. The world would warm and green and offer its abundance again. Winter was never permanent, never final. It was a season to be endured, yes, but also a season that tested and strengthened, that required communities to draw on their accumulated knowledge and their reserves of courage, that proved again in each generation that the survival was possible through cooperation and competence. And if spring always came for them, after winters that were colder and longer and more threatening than anything you're likely to experience, then whatever winters you face, metaphorical or literal, personal or collective, these too shall pass. Not without effort, not without some scars, not without the requirement that you draw on your own reserves of endurance and ingenuity. But they will pass. Spring comes, life continues, the wheel turns. Rest in that certainty, the same certainty that allowed the winter scout to close his eyes in his snow shelter, that allowed Wabasha to finally set down the weight of his decisions and sleep, that allowed every member of the winter camp to surrender to rest despite the cold and the dark and the uncertainties of the season. Winter is not forever, the cold does not last eternally, and you, like all humans before you, possess the capacity to endure difficult times and emerge from them still capable of joy, still ready to engage with whatever comes next, still connected to the long chain of human experience that stretches back to those winter scouts and forward to descendants you'll never meet. The fire burns low, the stars wheel slowly overhead in their eternal patterns. The winter wind sighs through bare branches and laden pines. Somewhere in memory and imagination, a scout sleeps in his shelter of snow and bough, a chief rests by his warm fire, an elder dreams of springs long past and springs yet to come. And you, lying comfortable in your warm bed, in your climate-controlled room, in your world of abundance and security, you too can rest now. The stories have been told. The journey through winter has been taken, at least in imagination. The distance between that world and this has been measured and appreciated. Sleep comes like spring after winter, inevitable, welcome, bringing restoration and renewal. Let it come. Let your breathing deepen. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally fade into the warm darkness behind closed eyes. You are safe. You are warm. You are connected across time to all the humans who faced their particular winters with whatever courage and competence they could muster. You carry their inheritance, their accumulated knowledge, their demonstrated capacity for endurance. And in the morning, though morning is still hours away, pleasantly distant, you will wake refreshed, restored, ready to face whatever challenges your own time presents. But that's for morning. Now is for rest. The Winter Scouts have shared their story. The chiefs and medicine people and elders have offered their wisdom. The season of cold and hardship has been remembered and honored. And now the stories fade, the images dissolve, the voices quiet. Only the darkness remains warm and comfortable, pulling you gently down into sleep. Rest well, traveller. You've journeyed far through these winter tales. You've walked in imagination through snow and cold, through hardship and endurance, through the complexities of survival in an unforgiving season. And now you can let it all go, can release the stories and the images and the weight of historical contemplation, can simply be here, now, warm and safe, and drifting toward dreams. The winter wind blows across the frozen landscape, but you are sheltered from it. The darkness is deep, but you are safe within it. The cold is bitter outside, but here, where you are, warmth surrounds you. Sleep now. Deep and dreamless or full of gentle dreams, either way, sleep. The stories will be here, if you ever need them again, these windows into how humans have always found ways to endure, to adapt, to persist through difficult times. But for now, simply rest. The night is deep, the bed is warm, and sleep, patient and kind, has been waiting for you all along. Welcome it in. Let go. Drift. Sleep.